Welcome to our channel, where history meets tranquility. Tonight, let our war sleep stories transport you to epic battlefields and moments of valor, all wrapped in soothing soundscapes designed to guide you into peaceful slumber. Where are you listening from tonight? Let us know in the comment section below. Whether you're unwinding after a long day or seeking a calm escape, you're part of a community that finds comfort in these tales of courage and resilience. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the echoes of the past guide you into the deepest sleep. Sweet dreams, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you. The year was 1781, and the humid Virginia night clung to the soldiers like a shroud. Private Joseph Plum Martin, a 21-year-old soldier from Connecticut, lay prone on the damp ground, clutching his musket. The soft hum of insects mixed with the low murmurs of men awaiting their orders. Joseph's heart pounded as he stared ahead into the dim silhouettes of British fortifications. The moon, a thin crescent, cast just enough light to illuminate the treetops, but left the battlefield below shrouded in darkness. Joseph glanced to his left where Sergeant Ebenezer Smith crouched, his broad frame tense as he scanned the horizon. "Keep your head down, Martin," he muttered. "They've got sharpshooters stationed, and they're not afraid to pick off stragglers." Joseph nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. The British had fortified Yorktown's perimeter well, and rumors of their precision shots had traveled through the ranks. Despite the tension, Joseph's mind wandered to his family farm in Milford. The images of his mother kneading bread at the worn kitchen table and his father tending to their fields felt like distant memories. He had enlisted years earlier, driven by youthful idealism and a fiery belief in the cause of liberty. Yet as the cannons roared in the distance, that fire flickered under the weight of reality. The night erupted with the sudden flash of a mortar. A fiery arc split the sky, its roar shaking the ground beneath Joseph's chest. The shell landed with a deafening explosion 100 yards away, sending dirt and debris into the air. The soldiers flinched, instinctively ducking lower into their positions. "This is it," whispered Ebenezer. "Dig in, lads. The siege has begun." 2 miles behind the American lines, General Jean-Baptiste Ernestine de Vimeur, Comte de Rochambeau, stood with an air of calm authority. The French general, resplendent in his polished blue and gold uniform, observed the American troops preparing for the assault. Around him, aides-de-camp scurried with maps and messages, their voices low but urgent. Rochambeau's sharp eyes betrayed no doubt this was a campaign meticulously planned with his American counterpart, George Washington. Washington approached, his tall frame silhouetted against the faint glow of a lantern. His face, lined with years of hardship, was resolute as ever. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that inspired confidence in even the greenest recruits. "Lafayette reports that Cornwallis remains cornered," Washington said, his voice steady. "The Chesapeake is secure, thanks to the French fleet. We must act decisively." The French Navy's victory at the Battle of the Chesapeake had been crucial. Admiral de Grasse had intercepted and defeated the British fleet, cutting off Cornwallis's escape by sea. The victory had emboldened the American and French alliance, and now Yorktown was within their grasp. Rochambeau nodded. "Your troops are ready, mon ami," he said in his thick French accent. "And so are mine. Tonight we begin the first trenches. By morning, the British will feel our presence." Their plan relied on methodical siege tactics. The French engineers, renowned for their expertise, would lead the effort to dig parallels, trenches that would gradually close the distance to the enemy's fortifications. These parallels would allow the artillery to pound the British defenses while protecting the advancing troops. Washington turned to Colonel Alexander Hamilton, who stood nearby. "Hamilton, take charge of the engineers. Ensure they follow Rochambeau's orders to the letter." Hamilton, youthful but fiercely intelligent, saluted sharply. "Yes, General." As the officers dispersed, Washington lingered, gazing toward Yorktown. In the distance, faint orange glows from British fires punctuated the darkness. He clenched his fists. This war, which had dragged on for 6 long years, was nearing its climax. But much remained uncertain. Would the siege hold? Could they force Cornwallis's surrender? These questions weighed heavily on him as the night stretched on. Inside the British stronghold at Yorktown, General Charles Cornwallis paced the floor of his headquarters. The room, lit by flickering candlelight, was filled with maps, reports, and half-drunk cups of tea. His officers stood in tense silence, waiting for their commander to speak. Cornwallis's brow furrowed deeply as he reviewed the latest intelligence. "The French fleet has cut us off entirely," he said, slamming a fist on the table. "There's no retreat by sea. Clinton's promised reinforcements are weeks away, if they come at all." The British general was no stranger to the complexities of war. He had faced the Continental Army and its French allies on numerous occasions, often outmaneuvering them with superior resources and tactics. But this time was different. Yorktown, a small tobacco port on the York River, was defensible in theory, but Cornwallis had underestimated the coordination of his enemies. Colonel Banastre Tarleton, a fiery cavalry commander, spoke up. "Sir, we could break through their lines before they entrench further, hit them with a midnight sortie, and scatter their forces." Cornwallis shook his head. "No, they've had months to prepare for this. Washington and Rochambeau know the importance of this siege, and their troops are well disciplined. We can't risk thinning our defenses." Another officer, Major Thomas Dundas, added, "Then we hold fast and pray Clinton arrives with reinforcements. Until then, we must conserve supplies and keep morale high." Cornwallis's lips pressed into a thin line. The morale of his men was a concern. After years of fighting, even the most loyal British soldiers were weary. The constant skirmishes, the unrelenting heat of the Virginia summer, and the knowledge of dwindling supplies gnawed at their spirits. Still, surrender was unthinkable. For the British Empire, Yorktown was a test of its resolve to retain its American colonies. Cornwallis dismissed his officers with a wave, retreating to a corner of the room where a half-finished letter to General Henry Clinton lay on his desk. Picking up the quill, he continued writing, the scratch of ink on parchment punctuating the heavy silence. "We are besieged on all sides. Without reinforcements, our situation grows more desperate by the hour. I await your orders, but fear time is not on our side." The night of October 6, 1781, brought a bone-chilling dampness to the air, but the soldiers of the Continental and French armies paid it no mind. Their orders were clear. Begin digging the first parallel trench. Private Joseph Plum Martin, spade in hand, worked alongside his comrades in silence, each thrust of the tool breaking into the stubborn earth. The dim glow of lanterns barely illuminated their work, and every sound, a distant hoot of an owl, the crunch of dirt, felt magnified in the stillness. "Keep your heads low and your hands steady," barked a French engineer, his accent heavy but his instructions clear. The trench was to be dug in a zigzag pattern, making it harder for British cannon fire to rake through the length. French engineers, seasoned veterans of European sieges, directed the operation, while American soldiers provided the manpower. Joseph glanced at the man next to him, a wiry Virginian named Caleb. "Never thought I'd be digging holes in the middle of a war," Caleb muttered, sweat dripping down his brow despite the cool air. "Thought I'd be shooting redcoats, not playing in the dirt." Joseph smirked, but kept his voice low. "This dirt might save your life, Caleb. Better to be down here than up there when the cannons start firing." Hours dragged on, and the trench took shape. Occasionally, a British cannon shot whistled overhead, crashing into the woods beyond with a thunderous roar. The soldiers froze each time, hearts pounding, before resuming their work. Not far away, Alexander Hamilton observed the progress with sharp eyes. Though just 24 years old, Hamilton had risen to prominence under Washington's mentorship, known for his brilliance and determination. This siege, he knew, was a turning point. "Keep them moving," he instructed one of the engineers. "Speed is as important as precision. We need that artillery in position by morning." By dawn, the first parallel stretched nearly a mile, running in a crescent around the British defenses. Exhausted but proud, the soldiers retreated to their camps, leaving the trench as the first visible mark of the noose tightening around Yorktown. October 9, 1781 brought a morning heavy with anticipation. General Henry Knox, commander of the Continental Army's artillery, stood on a rise overlooking the freshly dug trenches. A stout man with an encyclopedic knowledge of artillery, Knox was tasked with coordinating the bombardment that would mark the true beginning of the siege. The French had contributed dozens of heavy cannons, their barrels gleaming in the sunlight. Alongside them, American guns stood ready, manned by crews eager to prove their mettle. Knox ran his fingers along the edge of a cannon's barrel, feeling its cold steel. "These guns will sing today," he muttered to his aide. Washington arrived soon after, accompanied by Rochambeau. The two generals exchanged nods, each recognizing the significance of the moment. Washington gestured toward the British defenses. "Let's remind Cornwallis who controls the field." At precisely 3 p.m., the first cannon fired. The sound was deafening, a thunderous crack that reverberated across the landscape. The shell arced through the sky, landing with a resounding explosion inside Yorktown's defenses. From the trenches, Joseph Plum Martin watched in awe as the barrage began in earnest. Cannon after cannon unleashed their fury, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The earth trembled beneath their feet as shells rained down on the British positions, shattering walls and sending plumes of dirt and debris into the air. Inside Yorktown, panic set in. General Cornwallis watched helplessly as his defenses crumbled under the relentless assault. "Return fire!" he bellowed to his artillery crews. British cannons roared in response, their shots aimed at the American and French trenches. But the Allied forces, protected by their fortifications, suffered few casualties. Among the British troops, Private Thomas Hughes gripped his musket tightly, his ears ringing from the explosions. He had joined the army to serve king and country, but now he wondered if this siege would be his last stand. "We can't hold this, not against that," he muttered to a nearby comrade, who nodded grimly. The bombardment continued late into the night, each explosion driving home the inevitability of Yorktown's fall. Amid the chaos of the bombardment, the residents of Yorktown huddled in cellars and makeshift shelters, praying for their survival. Mary Slaughter, the wife of a local merchant, clutched her young daughter to her chest as the ground shook around them. "Will it ever stop, Mama?" the child asked, her voice trembling. Mary forced a smile, though her heart ached with fear. "It will, my love. Just hold on a little longer." Across town, enslaved workers who had been pressed into service by the British Army labored under fire, digging trenches and repairing fortifications. James Armistead, a spy for the American cause, moved among them, listening for information he could pass to Lafayette. The Frenchman had taken a keen interest in James's reports, knowing they could provide critical insights into British plans. "Keep your head down and your ears open," James muttered to himself as he hauled a crate of supplies. "Every word counts." The siege was as much a test of endurance for the civilians as it was for the soldiers. Each day brought new horrors, but also new acts of courage and resilience. October 11th, 1781 brought an urgent meeting of the Allied High Command. Inside a makeshift tent headquarters, George Washington, General Rochambeau, and their senior officers huddled over a map of the Yorktown's fortifications. The British defenses were weakening under the relentless bombardment, but two critical redoubts, number 9 and number 10, remained intact. Positioned on the far ends of the British line, these strongholds anchored Cornwallis's defense and needed to be captured for the siege to progress. Washington's finger traced the map as he spoke. "We will take both redoubts in a single night. One force will attack Redoubt 9, the other Redoubt 10. Speed and surprise will be our greatest assets." Rochambeau nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "My French troops will lead the assault on Redoubt 9. They are ready for the task." Washington turned to Marquis de Lafayette, the young French nobleman who had become a trusted general in the Continental Army. "Lafayette, you will oversee the assault on Redoubt 10. I trust you'll find capable commanders to lead the charge." Lafayette nodded, his expression resolute. "I already have someone in mind, General." He glanced toward Alexander Hamilton, who stood silently at the edge of the room. Hamilton, eager to prove his worth in battle after years of staff work, met Lafayette's gaze with a determined nod. For Alexander Hamilton, the coming assault was a chance to prove himself not just as a strategist, but as a soldier. Since the war's early days, he had served as Washington's aide-de-camp, drafting orders and managing correspondence. But Hamilton longed for the chance to fight directly on the battlefield. That evening, he approached Washington. "General, I request permission to lead the attack on Redoubt 10. Washington regarded him with a mixture of admiration and caution. "You understand the risk, Hamilton. The assault will be swift and brutal. Are you certain you want this responsibility?" Hamilton's voice was steady. "I am, sir. I've spent years watching others fight this war. It's time I did my part. On the front line." Washington nodded slowly. "Very well. Lead your men with honor, and may fortune favor you." Hamilton wasted no time organizing his force, selecting a group of 400 soldiers from the Light Infantry Corps. Among them was Private Joseph Plum Martin, who listened intently as Hamilton outlined the plan. The soldiers were to advance under cover of darkness, using bayonets only to maintain silence. No shots would be fired until the redoubt was taken. "Men," Hamilton said, his voice firm but calm, "tonight we strike a decisive blow. The enemy is strong, but so are we. Follow me, and together we will carry the day." The night of October 14, 1781, was moonless, the darkness a blanket over the battlefield. Hamilton's men crept forward in silence, their movements masked by the distant rumble of artillery. Ahead the British redoubt loomed, its palisades and earthen walls guarded by sentries. At a signal from Hamilton, the men surged forward, a whisper of movement turning into a storm. British sentries shouted in alarm, but it was too late. The Americans were upon them, scaling the walls with ladders and hacking through obstacles with axes. Joseph scrambled up the ladder, his muscles straining as he hoisted himself over the parapet. The chaos of battle erupted around him, shouts, screams, the clash of steel on steel. A British soldier lunged at him, and Joseph parried with his bayonet, the force of the strike sending shockwaves through his arms. Hamilton, in the thick of the fight, urged his men forward. "Take the redoubt! Push them back!" His voice, clear and commanding, rallied the troops as they overwhelmed the British defenders. Within 30 minutes, Redoubt 10 was secured. American soldiers raised a triumphant cheer, their voices carrying over the battlefield. While Hamilton led the charge on Redoubt 10, French forces under Colonel Guillaume Dupont assaulted Redoubt 9. The French soldiers, disciplined and battle-hardened, advanced with precision. Leading from the front was the Chevalier de Guimet, Lafayette's former aide-de-camp. The French troops encountered fierce resistance, with British soldiers firing volleys from behind their fortifications. But the French pressed on, scaling the walls and engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Captain Louis de Fleury, a French officer known for his bravery, seized a moment of opportunity. Spotting a British officer rallying his troops, de Fleury charged forward, disarming him and turning the tide of the skirmish. By dawn, both redoubts were in Allied hands. Washington, observing the battlefield through his telescope, allowed himself a rare smile. "The day is ours," he said softly. The capture of redoubts 9 and 10 marked the beginning of the end for Cornwallis. The Allied forces now had a direct line to bombard the British inner defenses, tightening the noose around Yorktown. The morning after the capture of redoubts 9 and 10, the Allied armies wasted no time consolidating their gains. General George Washington stood at the edge of the newly fortified redoubt, his piercing gaze fixed on the British inner defenses. The air smelled of damp earth and gunpowder, the battlefield quiet but tense after a night of violent struggle. Beside him, General Rochambeau studied the lines with a practiced eye. "The British will not recover from this," Rochambeau said confidently. "We are now close enough to unleash our full artillery barrage. Cornwallis has nowhere left to run." Washington nodded but remained cautious. "Victory is near, but Cornwallis is a resourceful commander. We must not underestimate his resolve." Behind them, the soldiers worked tirelessly, expanding the trench networks and moving heavy artillery into position. Henry Knox coordinated the effort, his booming voice cutting through the din. "Bring up the 18-pounders. I want every gun ready to fire by nightfall." Among the men hauling cannons was Private Joseph Plum Martin. Though exhausted from the previous night's assault, Joseph found renewed energy in the sight of their progress. The British fortifications, once imposing, now appeared fragile under the relentless Allied pressure. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Allied artillery opened fire. Cannons roared, sending shells crashing into the British lines. Inside Yorktown, chaos reigned. Inside the British stronghold, General Charles Cornwallis convened his officers for an emergency meeting. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with tension and the acrid smell of smoke. Maps and reports lay scattered across the table, marked with hastily drawn lines and notes. "We cannot hold much longer," Cornwallis admitted, his tone grim. "Our defenses are crumbling under their bombardment, supplies are dwindling, and the men are exhausted." Colonel Banastre Tarleton, known for his aggressive tactics, leaned forward. "We must act, sir. A breakout is our only chance. Hit their lines at night and carve a path to freedom." Cornwallis shook his head. "A breakout is suicide. Washington and Rochambeau have anticipated every move. The French fleet blocks our retreat by sea, and Clinton's reinforcements are nowhere in sight." Major Thomas Dundas added, "Then we hold out as long as we can. Perhaps Clinton will arrive before we're forced to surrender." The room fell silent. Cornwallis, a proud and capable commander, felt the weight of inevitability bearing down on him. Surrender was unthinkable for a man of his rank, yet the reality of their situation left few alternatives. As the bombardment continued, Cornwallis penned another desperate letter to General Sir Henry Clinton in New York. The situation is critical. The enemy is closing in on all sides. Without immediate reinforcements, we will be compelled to yield. In the shadow of Yorktown, James Armistead Lafayette moved with practiced ease among the British camp. Disguised as a servant, the enslaved man had spent months gathering intelligence for the American cause. His ability to blend in had earned him the trust of British officers who discussed plans openly in his presence. That evening, as cannon fire lit up the night sky, James overheard a critical conversation between two officers. They spoke of Cornwallis's dwindling supplies and his reluctance to launch a breakout. Slipping away unnoticed, James made his way to the American lines. He approached Marquis de Lafayette's camp under the cover of darkness, delivering the valuable information. Lafayette listened intently as James recounted what he had learned. "Cornwallis is running out of options," James concluded. "If we keep the pressure on, he won't last much longer." "You've done more for this cause than most soldiers," Lafayette said, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "History will remember your service." By October 17, 1781, the Allied forces had advanced their artillery to point-blank range. From their positions, they unleashed a devastating barrage on Yorktown. Cannons fired relentlessly, shattering walls and reducing buildings to rubble. General Henry Knox, coordinating the barrage, watched with satisfaction as the British defenses crumbled. "This is it," he said to an aide. "They won't last another day under this fire." Inside Yorktown, soldiers and civilians alike cowered in cellars and makeshift shelters. Private Thomas Hughes, a British infantryman, huddled with his comrades as the walls around them shook. "How much longer can we take this?" he muttered, his voice filled with despair. General Cornwallis, his headquarters now under direct fire, knew the time had come. Calling for his aide, he dictated a message to Washington. "Sir, I propose a cessation of hostilities for 24 hours so that we may discuss terms of surrender." The message was sent under a white flag carried by a British officer who rode cautiously toward the American lines. When the British envoy arrived, General Washington refused to meet personally with Cornwallis's representatives. Instead, he sent his deputy, General Benjamin Lincoln, to handle the negotiations. Washington's reasoning was clear. The British had shown him no such courtesy after his defeat at Fort Washington earlier in the war. Over the course of the day, terms were agreed upon. Cornwallis's army would surrender its weapons and become prisoners of war. British officers were allowed to retain their personal sidearms, but no honors of war would be granted. The surrender ceremony was scheduled for October 19, 1781. The morning of October 19, 1781 dawned clear and crisp. Inside Yorktown, the British troops prepared for the humiliation of surrender. General Charles Cornwallis, stricken by illness and perhaps unwilling to face the ignominy of defeat, delegated the task of surrender to his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara. British soldiers formed ranks under O'Hara's command, their red coats dulled by weeks of battle and siege. Private Thomas Hughes stood among them, his musket slung over his shoulder. The bitterness of defeat hung heavy in the air. "Keep your head up, Hughes," a sergeant muttered. "We'll live to fight another day." On the other side of the battlefield, Allied soldiers assembled in two columns to witness the surrender. One column consisted of American troops, led by General George Washington, and the other comprised French forces under General Rochambeau. Drummers beat a solemn cadence as the British marched out of their fortifications, their steps heavy with defeat. At the appointed time, General O'Hara approached the Allied lines, riding a spirited horse and carrying Cornwallis's sword. Washington, standing tall in his blue and buff uniform, remained steadfast. As O'Hara reached the American column, he attempted to surrender the sword directly to Washington, but the general did not move. Instead, Washington gestured to General Benjamin Lincoln, his trusted subordinate, to accept the surrender. Lincoln stepped forward, his face impassive, and received the sword from O'Hara. The gesture was deliberate, Washington's way of reminding the British of their own treatment of the Americans after earlier defeats. The British troops then began the formal surrender, stacking their arms in a designated field. Joseph Plum Martin, watching from the American ranks, felt a swell of pride. The British, who had once seemed invincible, were now laying down their weapons before the ragtag army of farmers, tradesmen, and idealists. As the British soldiers stacked their muskets and unfurled their colors, a haunting melody filled the air. The world turned upside down. The choice of song was deliberate, symbolizing the seismic shift in power and fortune brought about by the surrender. The surrender of Cornwallis's army marked a turning point in the Revolutionary War, and the Allied forces celebrated their hard-fought victory. That evening, General Washington hosted a banquet for his officers and their French allies. Spirits were high as they toasted the success of their partnership and the prospects for independence. Lafayette, seated beside Rochambeau, raised his glass. "To unity and perseverance," he declared. "We have proven that liberty is worth any sacrifice." Henry Knox, ever the jovial presence, added, "And to the power of a well-placed cannon." Laughter rippled through the room. For many, however, the victory was bitter-sweet. Joseph Plum Martin sat quietly by the campfire, reflecting on the friends he had lost in the war. The triumph at Yorktown was a testament to their sacrifice, but it did not erase the pain of their absence. Alexander Hamilton, too, felt the weight of the moment. Though he had proven his valor during the assault on Redoubt 10, his thoughts drifted to the unfinished work of building a new nation. "This is only the beginning," he remarked to a fellow officer. "The real challenge lies ahead." The General Charles Cornwallis, the days following the surrender, were marked by a deep sense of failure. Though he had fought valiantly throughout the campaign, his defeat at Yorktown overshadowed his earlier successes. In his personal correspondence, Cornwallis expressed his frustrations. Writing to Sir Henry Clinton, he lamented the lack of reinforcements and the insurmountable odds he had faced. "We were outflanked and outgunned," he admitted. The Allied forces executed their strategy with precision, and their resolve proved unbreakable. Despite his disappointment, Cornwallis maintained a degree of professionalism. He ensured his remaining troops were treated with dignity, and worked to secure fair treatment for British prisoners of war. Though Yorktown marked the effective end of major hostilities, the war was not officially over. Diplomatic efforts began in earnest, with both sides seeking to negotiate a lasting peace. Benjamin Franklin, serving as an American envoy in Paris, played a key role in the negotiations. His charm and wit endeared him to French officials, who had grown increasingly invested in the American cause. "Yorktown has proven what we are capable of," Franklin wrote to Washington. "Now we must secure the fruits of our labor." In the months that followed, preliminary agreements laid the groundwork for the Treaty of Paris, which would formally recognize American independence in 1783. In November 1781, with the victory at Yorktown secured, General George Washington returned to his beloved estate, Mount Vernon, for the first time in over 6 years. The journey home was both a physical retreat and an emotional respite after the harrowing years of war. Riding through the familiar Virginia countryside, Washington's thoughts were clouded with questions about the future. While Yorktown had effectively ended major combat, the war was not officially over. Would the peace talks in Paris hold? Could the fledgling nation survive the challenges of governance? When Washington finally reached Mount Vernon, his wife, Martha, greeted him with open arms. Their reunion was a rare moment of solace. Martha had managed the estate in his absence, enduring the strain of war with quiet resilience. Yet even at home, Washington remained busy. Letters from Congress, fellow generals, and foreign dignitaries arrived daily. One evening, as he reviewed reports by candlelight, Washington confided in Martha. "This victory at Yorktown is not mine alone," he said. "It belongs to every soldier, every ally, and every civilian who endured hardship for this cause. But our work is far from over." For Marquis de Lafayette, Yorktown was both a triumph and a farewell. The young Frenchman had poured his heart into the American cause, but with victory achieved, his duty to his homeland called him back to France. Before departing, Lafayette met with Washington one final time. The two men, who had formed a father-son bond during the war, shared an emotional goodbye. "General," Lafayette began, his voice thick with emotion, "serving under your command has been the greatest honor of my life. I shall never forget the lessons you have taught me." Washington clasped Lafayette's shoulder. "My dear Marquis, you have been more than a soldier to me. You have been a friend and a son. May fortune favor you always." As Lafayette's ship departed from the Chesapeake Bay, he looked back at the land he had come to love. Though his role in the American Revolution had ended, Lafayette vowed to continue advocating for liberty wherever he went. For the British soldiers taken prisoner at Yorktown, the aftermath of surrender was a bitter pill to swallow. General Charles O'Hara took charge of ensuring his men were treated humanely, even as their spirits remained low. Private Thomas Hughes, now a prisoner of war, reflected on his fate. The march to the temporary camps was grueling, but the Americans treated the prisoners with unexpected kindness. Local civilians brought food and supplies, while American guards allowed the men to rest along the way. One evening, Thomas struck up a conversation with Joseph Plum Martin, one of his captors. "You fought well," Thomas admitted grudgingly. Joseph nodded, his expression serious. "So did you. But this war isn't just about fighting. It's about freedom." The brief exchange left both men thoughtful. Despite being on opposite sides of the conflict, they shared a soldier's understanding of hardship and sacrifice. General Jean-Baptiste de Rochambeau returned to his camp after the Yorktown surrender, his demeanor calm, but satisfied. As commander of the French forces, Rochambeau's leadership had been instrumental in securing victory. One of his officers, Colonel Guillaume Dupont, approached him with a question that lingered in the minds of many. "General, do you believe this victory will lead to lasting peace?" Rochambeau considered the question carefully. "Peace is never guaranteed, Colonel, but we have given the Americans a fighting chance. The rest is up to them." Rochambeau's pragmatism was rooted in years of military experience. He understood the complexities of war and diplomacy, recognizing that Yorktown was a stepping stone rather than an endpoint. As a prisoner of honor, General Charles Cornwallis was afforded respectful treatment by his captors, yet the sting of defeat weighed heavily on him. In the days following the surrender, Cornwallis penned a series of letters to friends and colleagues in Britain, reflecting on the campaign. To Lord Germain, he wrote, "I must report that our position at Yorktown was untenable from the outset. The enemy's coordination with their French allies was impeccable, and the naval blockade sealed our fate." Cornwallis also took a moment to acknowledge the humanity of his adversaries. "Despite our bitter conflict, I must commend General Washington for his conduct. He is a man of great character and dignity." While Cornwallis remained steadfast in his loyalty to the crown, his experience at Yorktown left him with a deep respect for the resilience and determination of the American forces. With the siege of Yorktown concluded, Admiral Francois-Joseph Paul de Grasse prepared to return to the Caribbean with the French fleet. The naval blockade he had orchestrated was a critical factor in the Allied victory, cutting off Cornwallis's escape route and ensuring British reinforcements could not reach Yorktown. Before departing, de Grasse met with Washington and Rochambeau. "Gentlemen," he said, "it has been an honor to fight alongside you. Let us hope that this victory will bring about a swift and just peace." Washington extended his hand. "Your contribution will not be forgotten, Admiral. This victory was as much yours as it was ours." As the French ships sailed out of the Chesapeake Bay, their flags fluttering in the breeze, the Allied leaders knew they had witnessed a moment of history. The partnership between France and the United States had achieved what once seemed impossible. In the weeks following the surrender at Yorktown, General George Washington became the face of American resilience and victory. Letters of congratulations poured in from leaders across the colonies, including Governor Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, who wrote, "Your perseverance and leadership have inspired not just your soldiers, but an entire nation. History will immortalize this triumph as a testament to the American spirit." Washington, however, was wary of premature celebration. In a letter to John Laurens, his aide-de-camp, he expressed his measured optimism. "The enemy may yet find ways to prolong this conflict. We must remain vigilant and steadfast until peace is firmly secured." Despite his cautious tone, Washington could not ignore the growing gratitude of the people. In towns and villages, celebrations erupted as news of Yorktown spread. Bells rang, bonfires blazed, and communities gathered to honor the soldiers who had fought for their freedom. Among those celebrating was Alexander Hamilton. Though young, he had emerged from Yorktown not just as a war hero, but as a rising star in the nascent government. In a private letter to his wife Elizabeth, Hamilton wrote, "This victory is but a chapter in a larger story. Our nation's true test lies in the governance we must now build, for without structure, liberty cannot endure." While Washington and his generals remained in Virginia to oversee the British withdrawal, many soldiers began their journey north to rejoin their families or garrisons. Among them was Private Joseph Plum Martin, who marched with his fellow Continental soldiers through the battered countryside. The journey was arduous, with supplies scarce and winter approaching. Yet the camaraderie among the soldiers lightened their burdens. Around campfires, they recounted tales of Yorktown, their laughter mingling with the crackle of flames. One evening, Joseph wrote in his journal, "We fought not for glory, but for the dream of a better future. Though weary, we march with heads held high, knowing we have played our part in a cause greater than ourselves. For many, the road home was both a physical and emotional journey, a chance to reflect on the sacrifices made and the victories earned. General Charles Cornwallis remained a prisoner of war, treated with dignity by his American and French captors. Though the defeat at Yorktown tarnished his reputation, Cornwallis maintained a stoic composure. In a letter to General Sir Henry Clinton, Cornwallis detailed his account of the siege. The coordination between Washington and Rochambeau was unlike anything I have witnessed. Their siege tactics, combined with the naval superiority of de Grasse, left us with no viable options. Despite the circumstances, Cornwallis found moments of humanity amid his captivity. He often conversed with American officers, including Alexander Hamilton, who admired the British general's military acumen. During one such conversation, Cornwallis remarked, "You have shown the world that determination and ingenuity can triumph against the mightiest of forces. It is a lesson I shall not forget." As British troops began their withdrawal under the terms of surrender, the logistical challenges of moving thousands of soldiers and their equipment became apparent. General Benjamin Lincoln, overseeing the process, worked tirelessly to ensure the transition was orderly. For soldiers like Private Thomas Hughes, the retreat was a humbling experience. Stripped of their weapons and uniforms, the British soldiers marched under the watchful eyes of their captors. Civilians along the route observed in silence, their expressions ranging from pity to scorn. One day, as the column passed through a small village, a group of American children approached Thomas and his comrades. To their surprise, the children offered them bread and water. Thomas accepted the food with a quiet "thank you." The simple act of kindness reminded him of the shared humanity that transcended the conflict. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin worked tirelessly to secure a favorable peace treaty for the United States. His charm and intellect made him a formidable negotiator, earning him the respect of both his French allies and his British counterparts. Franklin's correspondence with John Adams and John Jay, who were also part of the American delegation, reflected the delicate balance they sought to achieve. Our task is not merely to end the war, but to lay the foundation for a lasting peace. We must secure our independence without alienating future allies or adversaries. The Treaty of Paris negotiations were marked by intense debates over territorial boundaries, trade rights, and the fate of loyalists. Franklin's patience and diplomacy ultimately prevailed, guiding the discussions toward a resolution that would recognize American independence. General Rochambeau returned to France as a hero, celebrated for his role in the American victory. Yet, for Rochambeau, the triumph at Yorktown was bittersweet. While he took pride in the success of the Allied forces, he remained acutely aware of the sacrifices made by his men. In a letter to King Louis XVI, Rochambeau wrote, "The victory at Yorktown is a testament to the strength of Franco-American cooperation. However, it is the bravery of the soldiers, both French and American, that deserves our highest praise." Rochambeau's homecoming was marked by parades and public accolades, but he quickly resumed his duties, preparing for the next chapter in his military career. In the months following Yorktown, the ripple effects of the victory spread across the colonies and beyond. For the soldiers who remained stationed in Virginia, the end of hostilities brought a mix of relief and uncertainty. General Washington remained in Williamsburg to oversee the logistical challenges of the British evacuation and the redistribution of troops. His correspondence revealed the complexities of maintaining order in the aftermath of a major victory. In a letter to the Continental Congress, Washington wrote, "Though the immediate danger has passed, we must remain vigilant. Our army is weary, supplies are scarce, and the war is not yet formally concluded." For Joseph Plum Martin, life in the encampments was marked by monotony, interspersed with moments of reflection. One evening, as he sat with fellow soldiers, Martin expressed a sentiment shared by many. "We've seen what can be achieved through unity. Now, I only hope that unity endures. For this land we've fought so hard to free." In Paris, negotiations for a peace treaty entered their critical phase. Benjamin Franklin, alongside John Adams and John Jay, worked tirelessly to secure terms that would recognize American independence while addressing issues such as territorial boundaries and trade rights. The British envoy Richard Oswald was pragmatic in his approach, acknowledging the inevitability of American independence. In his discussions with Franklin, Oswald remarked, "The world has changed. The colonies have proven their resolve, and it is time for Britain to adapt to this new reality." Franklin's ability to blend charm with sharp negotiation tactics earned him respect on all sides. His letters to Washington reflected cautious optimism. "The groundwork for peace is laid, though much remains to be finalized. I trust that this will be a peace worthy of the sacrifices made by so many." Alexander Hamilton, still in Virginia after Yorktown, began contemplating his role in shaping the nation's future. His experience in the war had solidified his belief in the need for a strong central government to unify the disparate states. During a conversation with Washington, Hamilton outlined his vision. "General, we have achieved a great victory, but the true test lies ahead. Without a firm structure, our nation will falter. We must create a government that ensures stability and justice for all." Washington, ever pragmatic, listened intently. Though he shared Hamilton's concerns, he also recognized the challenges of building consensus among the states. "Your ideas have merit, Hamilton, but the road to such unity will be long and fraught with resistance," Washington replied. These discussions planted the seeds for Hamilton's future contributions to the Federalist Papers and the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. General Charles Cornwallis was repatriated to England in early 1782. Though publicly he maintained a stoic demeanor, privately he grappled with the implications of his defeat. In a letter to Lord North, the British Prime Minister, Cornwallis provided a candid assessment of the campaign. "The fault does not lie solely with the army in America. Strategic miscalculations and underestimation of the enemy's resolve have led us to this point. The Americans, though inexperienced, have shown remarkable tenacity." Cornwallis's observations were not lost on his superiors. His insights would influence British military strategy in future conflicts, though the loss of the American colonies remained a bitter chapter in Britain's history. For Marquis de Lafayette, Yorktown was not merely a military victory, but a reaffirmation of his ideals. Returning to France, Lafayette became an advocate for liberty, using his experiences in America to inspire reform in his homeland. In a speech to the French National Assembly, Lafayette reflected on the lessons of the American Revolution. "The spirit of liberty is universal. What we achieved in America can serve as a beacon for all nations seeking freedom and equality." His efforts would later position him as a key figure in the early stages of the French Revolution, bridging the ideals of the American and French struggles for independence. Though Yorktown marked a decisive victory, the Continental Army remained on alert. Washington, wary of British reinforcements or renewed offensives, kept his troops in readiness. Private Joseph Plum Martin, stationed in Newburgh, New York, recorded the tension among the soldiers. "We knew the war was all but over, yet the uncertainty gnawed at us. Every day we wondered, will we be called to fight again, or is this truly the end?" Washington's leadership during this period was crucial. His ability to maintain discipline and morale among his men ensured the army remained a cohesive force, ready to act if needed. For loyalists, colonists who had sided with Britain, the victory at Yorktown signaled an uncertain future. Many faced ostracism or confiscation of their property. Some, like Colonel Beverly Robinson, chose to return to Britain, while others sought to reintegrate into American society. Robinson wrote to a former friend, lamenting his position. "Though I believed in the Crown's cause, I now find myself adrift. The land of my birth is no longer my home, and the bonds I once cherished are irreparably broken." The plight of loyalists highlighted the deep divisions within American society, divisions that would take years to heal. As the Continental Congress awaited the formal conclusion of the war, its members began grappling with the challenges of governance. Leaders like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson debated the principles that would guide the new nation. Jefferson, in a letter to Adams, captured the enormity of the moment. "We stand at the precipice of history. The choices we make now will determine whether our experiment in liberty succeeds or fails." Their correspondence reflected the ideological diversity within the Congress, a diversity that would shape the foundations of the United States. Benjamin Franklin, ever the diplomat, spent the final months of 1782 navigating the delicate threads of international politics to secure a lasting peace. His patience and strategic brilliance were pivotal in convincing the British to accept terms that would fully acknowledge American independence. In one crucial meeting with British envoy Richard Oswald, Franklin emphasized the broader significance of the treaty. "This is not merely an end to hostilities, it is the foundation of a new era. If we build this peace with wisdom and generosity, it will benefit both our nations for generations to come." Franklin's ability to articulate a vision for mutual prosperity helped soften the British stance on key issues, including territorial rights and fishing privileges. His relentless efforts were chronicled in letters to John Jay, where he described the nuances of the negotiations. "We must balance firmness with diplomacy, ensuring our independence is respected while fostering relationships that will sustain our fledgling nation." For many Continental soldiers, the path home was fraught with uncertainty. Despite their victory, financial compensation for their service remained elusive. In Newburgh, New York, the Army's growing frustration reached a boiling point. Private Joseph Plum Martin wrote of the discontent in his journal. "We fought for liberty yet find ourselves unpaid and overlooked. The promise made to us seems as distant as the battles we endured." General Washington, aware of the unrest, addressed the troops in a pivotal speech. Standing before his men, he urged them to trust in the new government. "Let us not tarnish the glory of our victory with discord. Our sacrifices have not been in vain. I implore you to place your faith in the principles we have fought to establish." Washington's words, coupled with his display of vulnerability, reading the speech with spectacles he admitted he rarely used, moved the soldiers profoundly. The potential mutiny dissolved, replaced by renewed, albeit strained, trust in their commander. John Jay, a key figure in the Treaty of Paris negotiations, played a crucial role in ensuring American interests were safeguarded. Unlike Franklin's conciliatory approach, Jay was more direct, refusing to proceed until British representatives fully acknowledged American sovereignty. In a letter to Congress, Jay explained his strategy. Diplomacy demands both patience and firmness. We must not yield on matters of principle, for they define the very independence we have fought to achieve. Jay's unyielding stance on territorial claims, particularly concerning the Mississippi River, secured critical concessions that would shape the young nation's expansion and prosperity. Back in France, General Rochambeau reflected on the legacy of Yorktown and the broader implications of Franco-American cooperation. Addressing the French court, he emphasized the lessons learned. Victory was not achieved by arms alone, but through unity and shared purpose. Let us remember that alliances forged in principle are far stronger than those built on convenience. Rochambeau's observations would influence French military doctrine, underscoring the importance of adaptability and coalition building in future campaigns. As the new American government began to take shape, thousands of loyalists faced difficult choices. Many chose to leave their homes, seeking refuge in Canada, the Caribbean, or Britain. Among them was Margaret Draper, a prominent Loyalist publisher in Boston. In a letter to a friend, Draper expressed her anguish. "I leave not out of loyalty to the crown alone, but because the land I once loved no longer welcomes me. It is a grief I cannot articulate." For others, like Colonel Beverly Robinson, exile was tempered by a sense of resignation. Writing to his son, Robinson reflected, "We are but pawns in a larger game, displaced by forces beyond our control. Yet I carry no hatred for those who remain. May they find the peace we could not." Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, remained a steadfast observer of the unfolding events. Her letters to her husband during this period provide invaluable insights into the challenges of post-war life. While the victory at Yorktown has filled our hearts with pride, the real work begins now. This nation, so young and untested, must find its footing amidst a sea of doubt and division. Abigail also highlighted the role of women in sustaining the war effort and rebuilding communities. We have endured the same trials as our men, though in different ways. Our labor, our sacrifices, and our hopes are woven into the fabric of this new nation. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was formally signed, marking the official end of the Revolutionary War. The American delegation, Franklin, Adams, and Jay, celebrated the moment with tempered joy. Franklin, reflecting on the significance of the event, wrote to Washington, "At last, we have secured not only peace, but recognition of our independence. It is a triumph born of sacrifice, perseverance, and unwavering belief in the cause of liberty." The treaty's terms included recognition of American sovereignty, the establishment of borders, and provisions for British troop withdrawals. In England, General Cornwallis faced public scrutiny for his role in the defeat at Yorktown. Though many blamed the broader failures of British strategy, Cornwallis's reputation was tarnished. In his defense, Cornwallis argued, "The American conflict was lost not in Virginia, but in the underestimation of the colonial will to resist. Yorktown was the culmination of years of misjudgment, not merely a single battle's failure." Despite the criticism, Cornwallis would later rehabilitate his career, serving in significant roles within the British government and military. In December 1783, General George Washington made a momentous decision to resign his commission and return to private life. In a ceremony before Congress in Annapolis, Maryland, Washington delivered a heartfelt speech. "Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action. I leave with a heart full of gratitude and unshakable faith in the future of our nation." His resignation set a powerful precedent for civilian control of the military, solidifying his legacy as a leader who prioritized the Republic over personal power. The years following Yorktown were marked by transformation. Soldiers returned to their families, leaders debated the foundations of governance, and a new nation began to take shape. For individuals like Joseph Plum Martin, life after the war was both challenging and fulfilling. In his memoirs, he reflected, "We were ordinary men, thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Our sacrifices were great, but so too was our cause. To see our country free is reward enough." In the spring of 1784, the Continental Army officially disbanded, marking the end of its service. For many soldiers, the transition from military life to civilian life was fraught with difficulties. Promised pay and land grants often remained undelivered, creating tensions among veterans. General Washington, deeply empathetic to his soldiers' plight, lobbied Congress for their compensation. In a letter to Alexander Hamilton, he expressed his concerns. "The bravery and dedication of our troops demand recognition. If we fail to honor our commitments, the very foundation of trust between the government and its defenders will crumble." Joseph Plum Martin, like many soldiers, returned to his family with little more than the clothes on his back, he later reflected in his memoirs. "We gave our youth to the cause of freedom, yet many of us returned to lives of struggle. Still, I would not trade my part in that great endeavor for anything." Major Benjamin Tallmadge, the head of the Culper Ring during the war, shifted his focus to politics after the disbandment of the army. With his keen sense of strategy and deep understanding of governance, Tallmadge was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in the 1790s. In a letter to John Jay, he wrote of his transition, "Oh, I no longer serve in the field. My duty to this nation continues. The pen may now be my weapon, but the cause of liberty remains my guiding star." Tallmadge's contributions to early American politics were underscored by his advocacy for veterans' rights and his support for a strong federal government. The Marquis de Lafayette returned to France in 1784, where he was hailed as a hero of the American Revolution. Inspired by the ideals of liberty he had witnessed in America, Lafayette became an advocate for reform in his homeland. In a speech to the French Assembly, Lafayette declared, "The triumph of freedom in America proves that the will of the people, united and resolute, can overcome even the mightiest of empires. Let us carry that torch forward." His efforts would eventually intertwine with the French Revolution, where he sought to balance the ideals of liberty and order. Abigail Adams continued to be a voice of wisdom and pragmatism, as her husband John Adams served as a diplomat in Europe. In her letters, Abigail documented the challenges of rebuilding a nation. While the men debate the grand ideas of governance, it is we who hold the threads of daily life together. The work of freedom is not done in grand halls alone, but in the fields, homes, and hearts of every citizen. Abigail's insights underscored the vital role of women in shaping the new republic, even as they remained excluded from formal political participation. General Charles Cornwallis, after his defeat at Yorktown, sought to redeem his reputation through service in the British Empire. Appointed Governor-General of India in 1786, Cornwallis implemented significant administrative and military reforms. In a letter to a colleague, he reflected on the lessons learned from America. The failure in the colonies was a harsh teacher. Here in India, I aim to govern with a blend of firmness and fairness, understanding that the strength of an empire lies in the consent of its people. Cornwallis's tenure in India was marked by significant changes, including the introduction of the Cornwallis Code, which reformed the judicial and revenue systems. One of the early challenges faced by the Continental Congress was managing the vast Western territories won during the war. The Land Ordinance of 1785, spearheaded by figures like Thomas Jefferson, established a framework for surveying and selling these lands. Jefferson, in a letter to James Madison, outlined the importance of the ordinance. The proper distribution of land will not only provide for the growth of our nation, but ensure that the principles of equality and opportunity remain at its core. The ordinance set a precedent for orderly expansion, laying the groundwork for future states to join the Union. Alexander Hamilton emerged as a leading voice advocating for a strong federal government. In the years following the war, he witnessed firsthand the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and began drafting proposals for a new constitution. During a heated debate with fellow statesman Patrick Henry, Hamilton argued, "Without a central authority, we are but a collection of squabbling states, vulnerable to both internal discord and external threats. Our independence must be fortified by unity." Hamilton's vision would culminate in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, where his influence shaped the foundational document of the United States. After resigning his commission, George Washington returned to Mount Vernon, longing for a quieter life. Yet, the pull of public service never fully released him. In letters to friends, Washington expressed his hope for the future while acknowledging the challenges ahead. "The victory we achieved was but the first step. The work of building a nation, I fear, will be even more arduous." Washington's time at Mount Vernon was marked by efforts to modernize his estate and promote agricultural innovation, reflecting his deep commitment to progress and sustainability. For the veterans of the Revolutionary War, life after the conflict was a mixture of pride and hardship. Groups like the Society of the Cincinnati were formed to provide camaraderie and advocacy for former officers. Henry Knox, the Society's first president, articulated its mission: "We must ensure that the sacrifices of those who served are neither forgotten nor in vain. Our bonds forged in war will remain unbroken in peace." The Society faced criticism for its perceived elitism, but it also played a vital role in preserving the memory of the Revolution and supporting its participants. By 1786, it was clear that the Articles of Confederation were inadequate to govern the new nation. Leaders like James Madison and George Washington began advocating for a convention to address these shortcomings. Madison, in a letter to Washington, summarized the urgency. "The foundations of our republic are shaky. Without decisive action, the liberty we fought for may crumble under the weight of disunion and inefficiency. Washington, though reluctant to return to public life, agreed to preside over the convention, recognizing the gravity of the moment. The bitter wind knifed through the threadbare coats of the Continental soldiers huddled near the icy Delaware River. It was December 22nd, 1776, and darkness had long fallen. The river surged in angry waves, choked with jagged chunks of ice that scraped and groaned as they ground against each other. General George Washington stood on the bank, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air as he surveyed the treacherous waters. His face betrayed none of the doubt clawing at his resolve. The fate of the Revolution, perhaps of liberty itself, teetered on this moment. Farther along the riverbank, Captain William Blackmore of the Pennsylvania militia tightened the straps of his boots and exchanged a weary glance with his men. They had marched for days with little to eat, their spirits as ragged as their uniforms. Yet, despite their exhaustion, a steely determination burned in their eyes. News of recent defeats in New York and New Jersey had spread despair, but tonight there was no room for doubt. This crossing, this assault, could either save the cause or doom it. Nearby, a young artillery officer named Alexander Hamilton knelt in the snow, carefully securing his brass field piece to the skiff assigned to his battery. Hamilton's fingers, raw and numb, fumbled with the ropes, but he worked methodically. He knew that the cannons, along with the element of surprise, were critical to their success. At the water's edge, John Glover, a seasoned mariner from Massachusetts, barked orders to the men of his regiment. Glover's marbleheaders were expert seamen, hardened by years of hauling fishing nets and navigating stormy seas. Tonight their skill was Washington's best hope of shepherding the army across the river alive. Glover's voice cut through the howling wind. "Steady now, boys! Keep the boats close, and for God's sake watch the ice!" As the first boat pushed off, the soldiers inside huddled close, their breaths mingling in the cold air. The oars dipped into the water with measured strokes, each splash swallowed by the roar of the wind and river. Washington stood motionless on the shore, silhouetted against the dim lantern light, watching his army embark on the perilous crossing. Washington's mind raced as he watched the boats vanish into the darkness. Only a week earlier he had penned a desperate plea to the Continental Congress. Unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place, this army must inevitably be reduced to 1 or 2 brigades. The defeats at Fort Washington and Fort Lee had been devastating, and enlistments were expiring. If this attack on Trenton failed, the revolution might collapse. The general's thoughts turned to the men under his command. Among them was Colonel John Hazlitt, a stoic Irishman leading the Delaware Regiment, known for their discipline and fierce loyalty. Hazlitt had been a steadfast ally, providing strength where Washington's own confidence faltered. Nearby, Brigadier General Hugh Mercer, a Scottish immigrant and veteran of the French and Indian War, tightened his cloak against the biting wind. Mercer, too, carried the weight of this mission on his shoulders, knowing that failure would mean not just defeat, but likely death for many. From across the river came the faint sound of voices, as Glover's men shouted commands. Washington strained to hear over the wind, his heart pounding as he waited for word. The plan required precision. The troops would cross in 3 waves, regroup on the far bank, and march 9 miles to Trenton. Timing was everything. He turned to Nathaniel Greene, the Rhode Islander who had become one of his most trusted generals. "This is a gamble," Washington admitted, his voice low. Greene nodded grimly. "A necessary one," he replied. Nearby, Joseph Martin, a 16-year-old private from Connecticut, clutched his musket tightly as he waited for his turn to board a boat. The boy's feet were wrapped in rags, his boots long worn through. He thought of his mother, who had wept when he joined the army. He had told her he wanted to fight for freedom, but now, shivering in the snow, he wondered if he'd ever see her again. By midnight the river crossing was in full swing. The Marbleheaders manoeuvred the Durham boats skillfully, guiding them through the ice-strewn waters with practiced ease. Soldiers bailed icy water from the boats with their bare hands, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they fought against the current. Among them was Henry Knox, a towering Boston bookseller turned artillery commander. Knox's booming voice rang out as he supervised the transport of his heavy cannons. Each gun weighed nearly a ton, and the icy conditions made their safe passage nearly impossible. Yet Knox remained undeterred. "Push, men, push!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with cold. "These guns will win the day!" On the opposite shore, Major General John Sullivan struggled to organize the troops arriving from the boats. Sullivan, a lawyer from New Hampshire, had earned a reputation for bravery, though his rashness sometimes tested Washington's patience. Tonight, however, Sullivan was all business. He moved swiftly among the men, checking weapons and issuing orders. The soldiers shivered in their soaked clothes, their breaths clouding the frigid air. Some clutched small objects, lockets, letters, wooden crosses, seeking solace as they prepared for battle. Others whispered hurried prayers. For many, the thought of a warm fire or a Christmas feast with their families seemed like a distant dream. As the last of the troops assembled on the far shore, the march to Trenton began. The soldiers moved in silence, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. The wind had eased, but the cold was unrelenting. Washington rode at the head of the column, his face set in grim determination. Behind him, the army stretched like a shadowy serpent through the darkness. Lieutenant James Monroe, a young Virginian serving as an aide-de-camp, walked alongside his comrades, his musket slung over his shoulder. Monroe had narrowly survived the disastrous retreat from New York and was eager to redeem himself. He exchanged a few quiet words with his friend, Captain William Washington, a distant cousin of the general. The two men shared a bond forged in the crucible of war, and tonight they were united in their resolve. As the first light of dawn began to break, the soldiers caught their first glimpse of Trenton. The small town lay silent, its streets blanketed in snow. Inside, the Hessian garrison slept soundly, unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon them. Washington halted the column and turned to his men. "The time has come," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "Victory or death?" And with that, the battle for Trenton began. Colonel Johann Rall, the commander of the Hessian forces stationed in Trenton, was known for his bravado and self-assuredness. The previous night, he had hosted a boisterous Christmas celebration at his headquarters. The Hessians, confident in their strength and security, had dismissed reports of continental activity in the area as exaggerated. Rall himself had ignored a warning letter delivered by a local loyalist, leaving it unopened on his desk as he indulged in wine and music. Now, as the first musket volleys erupted in the streets, Rall woke with a start. The unmistakable crack of gunfire and the pounding of artillery shattered the morning calm. He stumbled to his feet, shouting orders to his aides. "To arms! To arms!" he bellowed, grabbing his sword and rushing out into the freezing air. The sight that greeted him was chaos. Continental soldiers advancing through the snow, their bayonets glinting in the pale dawn light. Rall's men scrambled to form ranks, many still pulling on their boots and coats. The Hessians had been caught off guard, their sentries overwhelmed before they could sound the alarm. The streets of Trenton became a battleground, with smoke and shouts filling the air as the Continental Army pressed forward. Brigadier General Hugh Mercer led his brigade through the narrow streets, his voice cutting through the din of battle. Mercer's experience as a soldier was evident in the way he directed his men, guiding them with precision as they swept through the town. Nearby, Captain William Washington and Lieutenant James Monroe charged alongside their troops, their muskets blazing. Monroe eager to prove his mettle, pushed forward into the thick of the fight. He spotted a group of Hessians rallying near a barricade and led a small detachment to confront them. As they closed the distance, a Hessian musket ball struck Monroe in the shoulder, knocking him to the ground. Blood poured from the wound, staining the snow beneath him. Despite the pain, Monroe urged his men to press on. Captain William Washington saw Monroe fall and rushed to his side, covering him as the Continental troops advanced. "You'll live, James," he said firmly, binding the wound with a strip of cloth torn from his own coat. Monroe nodded weakly, his determination undimmed despite the injury. At the edge of the town, Henry Knox and his artillerymen positioned their cannons with practiced efficiency. The massive guns, dragged through the snow and mud with Herculean effort, now roared to life. Each shot sent shrapnel tearing through the Hessian ranks, sowing panic and confusion. Knox directed his men with booming commands, his deep voice rising above the cannon fire. He knew that maintaining steady fire was crucial to breaking the enemy's morale. One of his gunners, a wiry young man named John Corliss, worked tirelessly to load the cannons despite the icy conditions. Corliss's hands were raw and blistered, but he showed no signs of slowing down. The artillery barrage created an opening for the infantry to advance. Continental soldiers surged forward, their war cries echoing through the streets. The Hessians, though well trained, were disoriented and demoralized. Many began to retreat, abandoning their positions under the relentless assault. Colonel Rahl, undeterred by the chaos around him, rallied what remained of his forces near the center of Trenton. He shouted orders in German, urging his men to hold their ground. Despite his flaws as a leader, Rahl was a brave soldier, and he refused to surrender without a fight. As the Continental forces closed in, Rahl led a counterattack, his sword flashing as he charged into the fray. The Hessians fought fiercely, their discipline and training evident even in the face of overwhelming odds. But the tide of the battle had already turned. A musket ball struck Rahl in the chest and he fell from his horse, clutching his wound. His aides rushed to his side, but it was clear that his injuries were fatal. "Tell the general I fought well," Rahl murmured, his voice faltering. His death marked the end of the Hessian resistance. By mid-morning, the battle was over. The Continental Army had captured nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers, along with much-needed supplies and ammunition. Washington's gamble had paid off spectacularly. The victory at Trenton was not just a tactical success, but a morale boost for the fledgling revolution. General Washington stood in the town square, his face betraying a mixture of relief and determination. He knew this victory was only the beginning. The war was far from over. Yet, for the first time in months, there was hope. As the prisoners were marched out of town, the Continental soldiers began to regroup. Among them was Joseph Martin, the young private who had survived his first major battle. Martin felt a surge of pride as he watched the Hessians lay down their arms. Maybe, he thought, this war can be won after all. The streets of Trenton lay eerily quiet in the hours following the battle. Smoke from cannon fire mingled with the icy breath of winter, creating a misty haze that hung over the town. The soldiers, weary from their fight, moved methodically to secure their hard-earned victory. General George Washington, his face lined with exhaustion, walked among the ranks, pausing to speak with his officers. He offered quiet words of encouragement to Brigadier General Nathaniel Greene, whose leadership had been instrumental in the victory. Greene, ever humble, deflected the praise. "The men deserve the credit, sir. They fought with the courage of lions." Washington nodded, his gaze drifting to the captured Hessians. The prisoners were lined up under guard, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. Among them was Major DeChow, who had been second in command under Colonel Rao. Despite his defeat, DeChow carried himself with dignity, though his grief over Rao's death was evident. Washington, ever the statesman, instructed his officers to treat the prisoners with respect. "This is a war for liberty," he reminded them. "We must show them the humanity we seek to defend." In the makeshift field hospital set up in a commandeered Trenton home, Dr. John Cochrane worked tirelessly to treat the wounded. Cochrane, a seasoned physician and surgeon for the Continental Army, moved from soldier to soldier with practiced efficiency. Beside him, an assistant named Benjamin Rush, a Philadelphia physician who would later sign the Declaration of Independence, prepared bandages and salves. Among the wounded was Lieutenant James Monroe, pale and weak from blood loss. Dr. Cochrane carefully examined the musket wound in Monroe's shoulder, shaking his head. "You're lucky, son," he said gruffly. "Another inch, and that ball would have severed the artery." Monroe, though in pain, managed a faint smile. "Luck favors the brave, Doctor," he replied. Nearby, Captain William Washington sat silently, watching over his friend. The two men had forged an unbreakable bond in battle, and Washington was determined to see Monroe through his recovery. Outside the hospital, soldiers like Private Joseph Martin assisted with the grim task of burying the dead. For Martin, the sight of lifeless bodies, both friend and foe, was a sobering reminder of war's cost. They were men like us, he thought, as he lowered a fallen Hessian into the frozen ground. News of the victory at Trenton spread like wildfire, lifting the spirits of a beleaguered nation. In Philadelphia, members of the Continental Congress, who had been teetering on the brink of despair, celebrated the triumph. John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail, describing the victory as a glorious achievement that would strike terror into the hearts of our enemies. In Morristown, New Jersey, General Charles Lee, recently captured by the British, received word of the victory with mixed emotions. Lee, known for his arrogance, had been critical of Washington's leadership. Now, confined to a British cell, he begrudgingly acknowledged the brilliance of the Trenton campaign. For Washington, the victory was not just a military success, but a psychological one. It proved that the Continental Army, though outnumbered and outgunned, could outwit and defeat a superior force. The triumph also bolstered enlistments, as news of the battle inspired men to join the cause. Despite the jubilation, Washington knew there was no time to rest. The British forces under General Charles Cornwallis were regrouping, determined to crush the rebellion. Washington devised a bold plan to strike again, this time at Princeton. On New Year's Eve, the Continental Army began its march toward Princeton. The men, still exhausted and underfed, pressed on through the bitter cold. Washington rode alongside them, his presence a source of inspiration. "The cause is not won by ease," he reminded them, his voice steady despite the howling wind. Among the soldiers marching was Colonel John Hazlitt, leader of the Delaware Regiment. Hazlitt had distinguished himself at Trenton, and his men looked to him with unwavering loyalty. As they trudged through the snow, Hazlitt encouraged them with stories of his homeland, painting vivid pictures of green fields and warm hearths. In the artillery train, Henry Knox supervised the transport of his cannons with his usual fervor. Knox, whose booming laugh often cut through the tension, kept the men's spirits high despite the grueling conditions. His artillery, he reminded them, would once again play a decisive role in the coming battle. As the army approached Princeton, Washington convened a council of war with his top officers, including Nathanael Greene, Hugh Mercer, and William Alexander, better known as Lord Stirling. The plan was daring: divide the army to flank the British forces stationed at Princeton while maintaining the element of surprise. Green, ever the strategist, proposed a route through the woods to avoid detection. Mercer, whose Scottish brogue carried a sense of authority, agreed. "We'll catch them unawares," he said confidently. Washington listened intently, weighing their advice. Though his leadership had been criticized in the past, the victory at Trenton had emboldened him. He gave the order they would strike at dawn. In the quiet hours before the battle, the soldiers prepared their weapons and whispered prayers. Joseph Martin, still a teenager, found himself wondering if he had the courage to face another fight. He thought of his family, far away in Connecticut, and resolved to make them proud. As night fell on January 2, 1777, the Continental Army encamped near Princeton, huddled around small fires for warmth. The soldiers whispered nervously, aware that Cornwallis's forces were closing in from Trenton to crush them. General George Washington, however, had no intention of waiting for Cornwallis to attack. Instead, he devised a daring plan to outmaneuver the British. Sitting in a makeshift command tent, Washington and his officers, Nathaniel Greene, Hugh Mercer, and John Sullivan among them, pored over a crude map of the area. Washington's idea was audacious. Leave a small detachment to maintain campfires and fool the British into thinking the army was still entrenched, while the main force would march under cover of darkness to attack Princeton. Henry Knox, the ever-pragmatic artillery commander, voiced his approval. "The guns can move quietly if we avoid the main road," he said, glancing at his officers. Greene, ever Washington's confidant, nodded in agreement. "It's bold," he said, "but boldness is what we need." Meanwhile, the soldiers prepared for the march. Joseph Martin, his young face lined with fatigue, sat near a fire with a few comrades. He rubbed his frostbitten hands together, wondering if this gamble would lead to salvation or ruin. Across the camp, officers like Alexander Hamilton and Captain William Washington made their rounds, ensuring their men were ready for the surprise maneuver. Shortly after midnight, the army began to move. The column, stretching for miles, trudged through icy fields and narrow back roads. The soldiers marched in silence, their breaths visible in the frigid air. Officers whispered commands as they urged their men forward. At the front of the column, General Washington rode on his horse, his silhouette barely discernible in the moonlight. His presence was a steadying force, a beacon of resolve in the uncertainty of the night. Nathaniel Greene walked alongside some of his men, offering quiet encouragement. His Rhode Island accent carried faintly through the darkness. "Stay steady, boys. We'll see this through." Further back, Alexander Hamilton marched with the artillery train, overseeing the movement of the cannons. The young officer's sharp mind was evident in his careful coordination of the guns, which had to be maneuvered over treacherous terrain without alerting the British. Among the soldiers was James Wilkinson, a young officer from Maryland. Wilkinson, though later infamous for his questionable loyalties, was at this time a capable and eager subordinate. He relayed orders efficiently, helping to maintain the column's cohesion. As dawn broke on January 3, the vanguard of the Continental Army encountered British troops near Stony Brook, a small tributary west of Princeton. These were reinforcements sent by Cornwallis to bolster the Princeton garrison. General Hugh Mercer, leading the advance guard, quickly realized the danger. Mercer ordered his men to form ranks and engage the enemy. The fighting was intense, with muskets cracking and bayonets clashing in close quarters. Mercer, a veteran of the French and Indian War, was a commanding presence on the battlefield, but the British, sensing an opportunity to eliminate a key figure, pressed their attack. Mercer's horse was shot out from under him, and he was soon surrounded by British soldiers. Refusing to surrender, Mercer fought valiantly with his sword until he was struck down by bayonets. His men, horrified but inspired by his bravery, rallied to drive back the British. Among those who witnessed Mercer's fall was Ensign William Kelly, a young soldier from Pennsylvania. Kelly later recalled the grim determination on Mercer's face as he fought to the last. "He was a lion," Kelly would write, "and his courage shamed us into fighting harder." As news of Mercer's fall reached Washington, he spurred his horse toward the fighting. Arriving at Stony Brook, he rallied the retreating Continental troops, riding directly into the line of fire. His imposing figure, clad in a blue and buff uniform, was unmistakable. "Stand fast, men," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "The enemy will break before we do." Washington's bravery electrified his troops. Nathaniel Greene and Henry Knox quickly moved to reinforce the line, bringing up fresh troops and artillery. Knox's cannons roared to life, their thunderous volleys forcing the British to retreat. Meanwhile, Alexander Hamilton directed his artillery battery with precision, targeting British positions and covering the infantry's advance. Hamilton's leadership earned him the admiration of his men, who marveled at his calm demeanor under fire. As the British line began to falter, Washington seized the moment. He ordered a full-scale assault, driving the enemy back toward Princeton. The Continental soldiers, their spirits lifted by their general's presence, surged forward with renewed vigor. The final British stand took place at Nassau Hall, the main building of the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University. The British had fortified the structure, using it as a makeshift barracks and stronghold. General John Sullivan led the assault on Nassau Hall, directing his men to surround the building. Alexander Hamilton, ever resourceful, positioned a cannon within range and fired directly at the structure. One of his shots crashed through the main door, sending splinters flying and scattering the defenders inside. Inside Nassau Hall, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Malhood, commanding the British troops, realized the situation was hopeless. With his men surrounded and outnumbered, Malhood reluctantly ordered a surrender. The sight of British soldiers laying down their arms brought cheers from the Continental ranks. The victory at Princeton was complete, and the Continental Army had once again defied the odds. Washington, standing amidst his officers and soldiers, allowed himself a rare smile. The triumph was not just a military success, but a strategic masterstroke, forcing the British to abandon much of New Jersey and regroup in New York. For soldiers like Joseph Martin, the victory was a validation of their sacrifices. "We proved," Martin later wrote, "that liberty was not an idle dream." Yet the cost was heavy. General Mercer, gravely wounded, was carried from the battlefield. Despite the best efforts of Dr. John Cochrane, Mercer succumbed to his injuries days later. His death was a devastating blow, but his heroism became a rallying cry for the army. Washington, reflecting on the campaign, knew that the road ahead would be long and arduous, but for the first time in months he felt a renewed sense of possibility. The victories at Trenton and Princeton had shown the world and his own men that the cause of American independence was far from lost. The Continental Army, victorious but weary, began its withdrawal from Princeton. General George Washington understood that lingering too long could spell disaster, as British reinforcements from Cornwallis were likely on the move. The Army's goal was to reach the relative safety of Morristown, where they could regroup and plan their next steps. Washington rode at the head of the column, his presence a constant source of reassurance for his soldiers. His mind was already racing with strategic considerations. The victories at Trenton and Princeton had been crucial, but he knew the war's outcome still hung by a thread. Colonel Israel Putnam, commanding a rear guard, organized the retreat to protect the army's vulnerable flank. Putnam, a seasoned leader with a reputation for quick thinking, ensured that the British would find nothing but empty fields and quiet roads in their pursuit. Among the soldiers trudging through the snow was Private Joseph Plum Martin. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him, but the sight of his comrades, marching resolutely despite their hardships, kept his spirits up. As they passed through small villages, local patriots offered what little provisions they could spare, strengthening the bond between the army and the people it fought to protect. In a small farmhouse near Princeton, General Hugh Mercer lay gravely wounded. Despite the best efforts of Dr. John Cochrane, Mercer's condition worsened. The brutal bayonet wounds inflicted during the battle had caused severe internal injuries, and infection was setting in. Mercer's close friend and fellow officer, Nathaniel Greene, visited him as often as he could. The two men spoke of their shared dreams for America's future, though both knew Mercer's time was short. On January 12, 1777, Mercer succumbed to his wounds. The news of Mercer's death spread quickly through the ranks, casting a shadow over the recent victory. Washington mourned the loss deeply, recognizing Mercer's contributions to the cause. Mercer's sacrifice became a rallying cry, symbolizing the immense cost of the revolution. In his honor, the fledgling nation would later name counties, towns, and streets after him, ensuring his legacy endured. By late January, the Continental Army reached Morristown, New Jersey, where they would establish winter quarters. The town, surrounded by hills and forests, provided a defensible position against British attacks. For the soldiers, however, the bitter cold and lack of supplies made survival a daily struggle. Washington worked tirelessly to secure provisions for his men. He dispatched Henry Knox and other officers to requisition supplies from nearby towns and farms. Despite the hardships, Knox remained a source of optimism, often lifting the men's spirits with his booming laugh and tales of past campaigns. Nathaniel Greene, serving as Quartermaster General, played a critical role in organizing the distribution of food and clothing. Greene's resourcefulness and attention to detail ensured that the army survived the harsh winter. "It is a hard life we lead," Greene wrote to his wife Catherine, "but the cause is just, and that is our comfort." For Joseph Plum Martin and his fellow soldiers, the monotony of camp life was broken by occasional drills and skirmishes with British patrols. Martin recorded the camaraderie that developed among the men, describing it as a bond forged through shared suffering. In New York City, General William Howe, the commander of British forces, fumed over the defeats at Trenton and Princeton. Howe had underestimated Washington's resourcefulness and was now under pressure to regain the initiative. Howe's subordinate, General Charles Cornwallis, advocated for a renewed offensive into New Jersey. Cornwallis, still smarting from Washington's escape at Trenton, sought to redeem himself. "The rebels are a fleeting nuisance," he declared to his staff, "and they must be eradicated with haste." Meanwhile, in London, news of the American victories caused a stir in Parliament. Supporters of the war effort, including Lord George Germain, sought to downplay the significance of the defeats. However, opposition voices, such as Edmund Burke, argued that the British strategy was failing. "You cannot conquer a people who fight with their hearts," Burke warned. The victories at Trenton and Princeton sparked a wave of renewed enthusiasm for the revolutionary cause. Across the colonies, men who had hesitated to enlist now stepped forward, inspired by Washington's success. In Philadelphia, Benjamin Rush worked tirelessly to rally support for the Continental Army. As a physician and statesman, Rush understood the importance of maintaining both the physical health and morale of the soldiers. He penned essays urging his fellow patriots to contribute to the war effort, whether through service, supplies, or donations. Among those inspired was Timothy Pickering, a Massachusetts officer who would later become a prominent leader in the Continental Army. Pickering's logistical skills and dedication to the cause made him an invaluable asset as the war progressed. Washington, recognizing the need for experienced leaders, also worked to recruit former soldiers who had left the army after their initial enlistments. Men like Daniel Morgan, a frontiersman with a reputation for bravery, returned to the field, bringing with them valuable skills and experience. The victory at Princeton had ripple effects far beyond the battlefield. In Europe, news of the American triumphs began to sway public opinion. French diplomats, including the Marquis de Lafayette, saw in Washington's leadership the potential for a successful rebellion. Lafayette, though not yet involved in the war, began advocating for French support of the American cause. In the colonies, the victories restored faith in the Continental Congress, which had been criticized for its inability to provide adequate support to the army. Leaders like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson praised Washington's achievements, recognizing them as crucial to maintaining public support for the Revolution. For Washington, however, the victories were merely a prelude. He understood that the road to independence would be long and fraught with challenges. As he reviewed reports from his spies in New York, including the invaluable intelligence gathered by Nathan Hale's successors in the Culper Ring, Washington began planning his next moves. As the Continental Army settled into Morristown, George Washington turned his attention to intelligence gathering. He understood that knowing the movements of British forces in New York was essential for future operations. To this end, he relied on a burgeoning network of spies, which would later be known as the Culper Ring. In the weeks following Princeton, Abraham Woodhull, operating under the alias Samuel Culper Sr., began covertly collecting information in British-occupied New York. Woodhull, a Long Island farmer, risked his life to deliver crucial intelligence on troop movements and supply lines. Working alongside him was Robert Townsend, or Samuel Culper Jr., a merchant who used his access to British officers to gather details from their conversations. Their coded messages were smuggled to Washington through couriers, like Anna Strong, who used a clothesline to signal drop locations, and Caleb Brewster, a daring sailor who ferried the reports across Long Island Sound. Washington, with the assistance of his trusted aide Alexander Hamilton, deciphered these communications to inform his strategy. In one of their reports, the Culper Ring revealed that British General William Howe planned to reinforce his positions in New Jersey. This intelligence allowed Washington to adjust his troop deployments, frustrating Howe's efforts to regain the initiative. The winter of 1777 tested the Continental Army's endurance. Morristown's encampment, though strategically advantageous, was a harsh environment. Snowstorms buried tents, and food shortages led to hunger and sickness among the troops. Dr. John Cochrane worked tirelessly to treat the soldiers, aided by volunteers like Benjamin Rush. Rush, while primarily stationed in Philadelphia, visited Morristown to assess the Army's medical needs. He wrote to Congress, urging them to allocate more resources for supplies and equipment. "The health of our Army is as vital as the strength of our arms," he insisted. Despite these challenges, the soldiers found ways to maintain morale. Joseph Plum Martin described how the men would gather around fires to share stories, sing songs, and even stage impromptu plays. Among them, Henry Knox often entertained with his booming laugh and tales of his early days in Boston. Washington, ever conscious of his men's suffering, led by example. He refused special treatment and shared in their hardships, earning their loyalty and respect. "If the general can endure this," wrote one soldier, "then so can we." While the Continental Army endured the harsh winter, the British forces faced their own difficulties. General William Howe struggled to maintain control of New Jersey, where local militias harassed his troops at every turn. One of the most effective leaders of these militias was Captain John Barry, a naval officer who turned to privateering after the loss of the Continental Navy's fleet. Barry and his men disrupted British supply lines along the Delaware River, capturing ships and seizing valuable resources. Meanwhile, Nathaniel Greene coordinated with local militia leaders to conduct raids on British outposts. Greene's ability to organize these guerrilla tactics frustrated the British and bolstered the confidence of the local population. In London, news of these setbacks further divided Parliament. Lord George Germain insisted that the rebellion could still be crushed, but critics like Charles James Fox argued that the war was unwinnable without a decisive shift in strategy. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin worked tirelessly to secure French support for the American cause. Franklin's charm and intellect won over key figures at the French court, including Foreign Minister Charles Gravier, the Comte de Vergennes. Franklin emphasized the significance of the victories at Trenton and Princeton, portraying them as proof that the Americans could hold their own against the British. His efforts were bolstered by Lafayette, who had grown increasingly enamored with the idea of American independence. By early 1777, French support began to take shape in the form of covert shipments of arms and supplies. These contributions, though limited, were a lifeline for the Continental Army. Henry Knox, upon receiving a shipment of French artillery, remarked that "these guns shall speak for liberty." Lafayette, eager to join the fight, began preparing for his journey to America. His enthusiasm was matched by his belief that the revolution was a cause worth fighting for, a belief he would carry with him through the darkest days of the war. As winter gave way to spring, Washington's attention turned to the northern theater of the war, where British General John Burgoyne planned a campaign to sever New England from the rest of the colonies. Washington dispatched troops under General Benedict Arnold and General Horatio Gates to counter this threat. Arnold, a fiery and fearless commander, played a pivotal role in the Battle of Saratoga, leading a daring charge that turned the tide of the fight. Despite being wounded, Arnold's actions inspired his men to push forward, ultimately forcing Burgoyne's surrender. Saratoga was a decisive victory that reshaped the war. News of the triumph reached Paris, convincing the French that the Americans were capable of defeating the British. In February 1778, France formally entered the war as an ally of the United States, bringing with it much-needed troops, ships, and financial support. For Washington and his army, the alliance with France was a beacon of hope. "The cause of liberty," he wrote to Lafayette, "has found a friend in your noble nation." In the summer of 1777, the Continental Army received word that the Marquis de Lafayette, a young French nobleman, had arrived in America. Lafayette, only 19 years old, was captivated by the ideals of liberty and determined to contribute to the revolution. Despite his youth, his enthusiasm and noble pedigree quickly caught the attention of George Washington. Their first meeting was marked by mutual respect. Lafayette presented himself with humility, requesting no special treatment despite his rank. Washington, impressed by his sincerity, invited Lafayette to join his staff as a major general. Over time, the two developed a deep bond, with Washington coming to regard Lafayette as a surrogate son. Lafayette's arrival was a morale boost for the army. His presence signaled that the American cause had gained international support. He quickly endeared himself to the troops, often sharing in their hardships. Private Joseph Plum Martin recalled seeing the young Frenchman rallying soldiers during drills, his energy contagious despite the grueling conditions. In the aftermath of the Saratoga campaign, General Benedict Arnold emerged as one of the Continental Army's most celebrated commanders. His bravery and tactical skill had been instrumental in securing the victory, and his name was on the lips of soldiers and civilians alike. However, Arnold's accomplishments were not without controversy. His fiery temper and contentious relationship with other officers, particularly General Horatio Gates, created friction within the Army's leadership. Gates, jealous of Arnold's success at Saratoga, downplayed his contributions in official reports, fueling Arnold's growing sense of resentment. Despite these tensions, Washington valued Arnold's abilities and defended him against criticism. "General Arnold is a man of action," Washington wrote to Congress, "and his courage on the field speaks for itself." Arnold's injuries from Saratoga, including a shattered leg, left him temporarily sidelined. During his recovery, he was assigned to the military command in Philadelphia, a post that would ultimately lead him down a path of betrayal. By December 1777, the Continental Army established its winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. The encampment, though close to Philadelphia, was isolated enough to protect against British attacks. It also became a symbol of the Army's resilience. The conditions were dire. Soldiers lacked adequate food, clothing, and shelter. Disease spread rapidly, with smallpox and dysentery claiming hundreds of lives. Despite these hardships, Washington worked tirelessly to maintain order and morale. He issued strict sanitation guidelines and encouraged his officers to support their men through the worst of the winter. Dr. Benjamin Rush visited Valley Forge to assess the dire medical situation. He collaborated with Dr. William Shippen and other surgeons to inoculate soldiers against smallpox, a controversial but effective measure that saved countless lives. One of the most significant developments during this time was the arrival of Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian military officer who volunteered his services to the Continental Army. Von Steuben's training methods, which emphasized discipline and efficiency, transformed the army into a more cohesive fighting force. Joseph Plum Martin recalled von Steuben's drills with a mix of humor and admiration. "He swore in languages we didn't understand," Martin wrote, "but his training gave us the skills we needed to stand against the British." While the Continental Army endured Valley Forge, Philadelphia remained under British occupation. The city, once a hub of revolutionary activity, had become a divided community. Loyalists thrived under British rule, while patriots operated in secret, resisting as best they could. Benedict Arnold, newly appointed as military governor of Philadelphia, navigated this fraught environment with increasing difficulty. His lavish lifestyle and interactions with prominent loyalists, including the influential Peggy Shippen, raised eyebrows among his peers. Shippen, the daughter of a wealthy loyalist family, would later play a pivotal role in Arnold's eventual defection. Arnold's administration was marked by allegations of corruption, further straining his relationships with other officers and members of Congress. Despite these challenges, Arnold maintained his reputation as a capable leader, at least for the moment. Meanwhile, in the shadows of occupied Philadelphia, ordinary patriots like Lydia Darrett worked to undermine British control. Darrett, a Quaker, used her position as a hostess for British officers to gather intelligence, which she then passed to the Continental Army. Her efforts helped foil several British plans, demonstrating the vital role civilians played in the revolution. As the war raged in the east, the western frontier saw brutal fighting between Patriot settlers and British-aligned Native American tribes. The Iroquois Confederacy, divided by the conflict, suffered devastating losses as traditional alliances fractured. One of the most notable figures in this theatre was Joseph Brant, a Mohawk leader and British ally. Brant, educated in English and versed in European military tactics, led raids against Patriot settlements in the Mohawk Valley. His leadership was both admired and feared, embodying the complexities of Native American involvement in the war. On the Patriots' side, General John Sullivan launched a campaign to neutralize the Iroquois threat. Sullivan's expedition, sanctioned by Washington, destroyed dozens of villages, leading to widespread suffering among Native American communities. Though the campaign was deemed a military success, its human cost left a lasting scar on the region. In his letters, Washington expressed regret over the necessity of such measures, but justified them as critical to securing the frontier. "It is a harsh truth of war," he wrote, "that we must protect our people at great expense." By 1779, Benedict Arnold's growing frustrations with the Continental Congress and his mounting personal debts led him down a dark path. His resentment deepened after facing a court-martial for alleged misuse of resources during his time in Philadelphia. Although Arnold was found guilty only of minor offenses, the trial bruised his pride and added to his grievances. In Philadelphia, Arnold had developed a close relationship with Peggy Shippen, a charming young woman with loyalist sympathies. Through her connections, Arnold began communicating with British Major John Andre. The two men struck a secret agreement. Arnold would surrender the strategic fort at West Point in exchange for money and a commission in the British Army. Arnold's treachery was nearly successful. On September 21, 1780, he met Andre near Haverstraw, New York, to finalize the details of the plot. However, Andre's capture by Patriot militiamen just days later exposed the scheme. Among the papers found on Andre were maps and plans of West Point, implicating Arnold beyond doubt. Washington, upon learning of the betrayal, was devastated. "Whom can we trust now?" he lamented. Arnold fled to British lines, narrowly escaping capture. Major Andre, despite his honor and the pleas of some American officers, was executed as a spy on October 2, 1780. As the war shifted south, British forces under General Henry Clinton aimed to secure the port city of Charleston, South Carolina. The city was a vital stronghold for the Patriots, and its capture would give the British a foothold in the southern colonies. The Continental Army, under the command of General Benjamin Lincoln, prepared to defend Charleston. Lincoln, a capable but cautious leader, struggled to rally enough troops and supplies to withstand the British assault. The British, supported by a formidable naval fleet, began their siege in March 1780. For weeks the defenders endured relentless bombardment. Soldiers like Peter Francisco, a giant of a man known for his extraordinary strength, fought valiantly to hold the lines. Francisco's feats of bravery became legendary, including single-handedly fending off a group of British soldiers during a skirmish outside the city. Despite their courage, the Patriots were ultimately overwhelmed. On May 12, 1780, Lincoln surrendered Charleston, marking one of the worst defeats of the war for the Continental Army. The fall of Charleston emboldened the British, but also galvanized the Patriot resistance in the South. Following the loss of Charleston, the Southern campaign became a brutal contest of guerrilla warfare. Leading the charge for the Patriots was Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox. Marion, a South Carolinian planter turned militia leader, pioneered hit-and-run tactics that frustrated the British and earned him a fearsome reputation. Marion and his men operated from the dense swamps and forests, striking quickly before disappearing into the wilderness. One of Marion's most trusted allies was Peter Ory, a former Continental officer who documented many of their exploits. Ory described how Marion's intimate knowledge of the terrain gave his small force an advantage over larger, better-equipped British units. British Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, notorious for his ruthless tactics, was tasked with hunting Marion down. Despite Tarleton's efforts, Marion eluded capture, his cunning maneuvers earning him legendary status among his fellow patriots. The success of Marion's guerrilla campaign inspired other resistance leaders, including Thomas Sumter and Andrew Pickens, to adopt similar tactics. Together they turned the southern backcountry into a battleground that sapped British resources and morale. In the wake of Charleston's fall, General Nathaniel Greene was appointed to command the Southern Department of the Continental Army. Greene, a Rhode Islander with a reputation for strategic brilliance, inherited a demoralized and poorly supplied force. Despite these challenges, he approached the task with determination and ingenuity. Greene's strategy was unconventional. Rather than directly confronting the British, he divided his forces, allowing smaller units to harass the enemy while avoiding large-scale engagements. This approach forced British commanders, including Lord Cornwallis, to stretch their resources thin. One of Greene's most trusted officers was Daniel Morgan, a veteran of Saratoga. Morgan led a key detachment that achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Cowpens on January 17, 1781. Using a clever tactic of feigned retreat, Morgan lured Tarleton's forces into a trap, inflicting heavy casualties and boosting Patriot morale. Greene's leadership revitalized the Southern war effort, turning the tide against the British. His campaign demonstrated that perseverance and ingenuity could overcome even the direst circumstances. By 1781, the war's momentum had shifted decisively in favor of the Patriots. The arrival of French reinforcements, including troops under the Comte de Rochambeau, and the fleet commanded by Admiral de Grasse, set the stage for a climactic showdown in Virginia. General Cornwallis, after months of setbacks in the south, fortified his position at Yorktown, believing the British Navy would provide support. Washington and Rochambeau saw an opportunity to trap Cornwallis. In a daring march, the Continental Army moved south from New York to join forces with Lafayette's troops in Virginia. The siege of Yorktown began on September 28, 1781. French and American forces encircled the British, bombarding their defenses day and night. Soldiers like Alexander Hamilton, now commanding a light infantry battalion, played key roles in the assault. Hamilton's men famously stormed Redoubt 10, a pivotal moment in the siege. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered, effectively ending major combat in the Revolutionary War. The victory at Yorktown was a testament to the resilience and determination of the Continental Army and its allies. As Washington watched the British lay down their arms, he remained mindful of the sacrifices that had made the moment possible. As the British laid down their arms at Yorktown on October 19, 1781, the air was thick with a mix of triumph and disbelief among the Continental and French forces. General George Washington, standing alongside the Comte de Rochambeau and Marquis de Lafayette, observed the ceremony with solemn dignity. Cornwallis, citing illness, sent his subordinate, General Charles O'Hara, to surrender in his place, a gesture that rankled the victors but underscored British humiliation. Alexander Hamilton, who had led the daring assault on Redoubt 10, watched the capitulation with pride. His success in the battle earned him praise from Washington and elevated his standing among his peers. Nearby, Lafayette reflected on how far the Revolution had come. his youthful idealism tempered by the realities of war but undiminished in its fervor. For the soldiers, the surrender was both a moment of celebration and a somber reminder of their sacrifices. Joseph Plum Martin, a veteran of many battles, wrote of the surreal feeling as he watched British troops stack their weapons. It seemed, he recalled, as if the spirit of liberty itself had triumphed. Although the victory at Yorktown effectively ended major combat, the war was far from over. British forces still held key positions in New York, Charleston, and Savannah, and formal peace negotiations were yet to begin. Washington cautioned against complacency, urging Congress to maintain the Army's readiness. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay began delicate negotiations with British diplomats. The American delegation insisted on full independence and favorable boundaries for the new nation, including access to the Mississippi River. Franklin's charm and diplomatic skill proved invaluable, as did the support of the French, who sought to weaken Britain's global power. Meanwhile, in America, Washington faced the daunting task of maintaining unity within the army. The soldiers, many of whom had gone months without pay, grew restless. Washington's leadership was tested in March 1783 during the Newburgh Conspiracy, when disgruntled officers considered a mutiny. In a dramatic meeting with his officers, Washington appealed to their loyalty and sense of duty. Removing his glasses to read a letter, he remarked, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown not only grey, but almost blind in the service of my country." His words diffused the crisis, reaffirming his place as the unifying figure of the Revolution. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, formally ending the Revolutionary War. The agreement recognized the United States as an independent nation and established its borders from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. For the American delegation, the treaty was a triumph. John Adams, ever the meticulous negotiator, expressed pride in the outcome, though he lamented the continued tension with Britain over issues like trade and loyalist reparations. Franklin, meanwhile, saw the treaty as a validation of his lifelong belief in the power of diplomacy. Back in America, the news of peace was met with jubilation. Soldiers began to disband, returning to their farms and families. Joseph Plum Martin, reflecting on the end of his service, wrote, "We had fought for liberty, and now we could enjoy its blessings." Washington, after bidding farewell to his officers, in an emotional gathering at Fraunces Tavern in New York City, returned to Mount Vernon. He hoped to retire to private life, though fate would soon call him back to serve the nation he had helped create. The end of the war marked the beginning of a difficult period for loyalists, those who had sided with Britain during the conflict. Many faced harassment, confiscation of property, or social ostracism. Some, like Peggy Shippen Arnold, the wife of Benedict Arnold, fled to British territories, starting anew in Canada or Britain. For Benedict Arnold, life after the war was a bitter decline. He settled in London but found little acceptance among his new peers. His treachery left him reviled in both America and Britain, and he died in 1801, a man haunted by his choices. Others, like Joseph Brant, worked to secure the rights of their communities in the aftermath of the war. Brant led efforts to resettle Mohawk and other Iroquois peoples in Canada, advocating for their interests even as the new United States expanded westward. The Loyalist exodus underscored the deep divisions the war had created, divisions that would take generations to heal. The victory at Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris were only the beginning of America's journey. The fledgling nation faced enormous challenges, from rebuilding its economy to establishing a stable government. Washington, though eager to retire, remained a guiding figure. His leadership at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 helped shape the framework of the United States government. Lafayette, inspired by the American experiment, returned to France, where he would play a key role in his nation's own revolutionary struggles. The war had left an indelible mark on those who fought it. Figures like Henry Knox, Nathanael Greene, and Alexander Hamilton continued to serve the new nation in various capacities, helping to lay the foundation for its future. For ordinary soldiers like Joseph Plum Martin, the revolution was a defining chapter of their lives, a chapter that shaped not only their personal identities, but also the identity of their country. Freeman's Farm, September 19, 1777. The air smelled of damp earth and powder. Timothy Murphy knelt behind the gnarled trunk of an oak tree, his rifle pressed against his shoulder. Around him the cacophony of war roared, musket fire, the thunder of cannons, and the guttural shouts of men throwing themselves into battle. He spotted his target through the smoky haze, a British grenadier barking orders to his men. The man's bright red coat made him an easy mark. Murphy exhaled, steadied his aim, and pulled the trigger. The grenadier dropped, but the victory was fleeting. Another British soldier rushed to take his place, and the line advanced. Murphy reloaded with shaking hands. He had been in battles before, but none like this. The fields of Freeman's Farm were a death trap, littered with bodies and slick with blood. A scream pierced the chaos, one of their own, young Peter Taylor, clutching his chest as he fell. "Timothy, get down," hissed a voice. Daniel Morgan, their grizzled leader, motioned frantically from a few paces away. "They're flanking us." Murphy ducked instinctively as musket balls whizzed overhead. Around him the sharpshooters scrambled to regroup. They had done their job, thinning the enemy ranks, but the British were relentless. Murphy stole a glance toward the open field, where the British lines surged forward with grim precision. General John Burgoyne's headquarters, September 19, 1777. General John Burgoyne leaned over the map spread across the rough wooden table. The distant sounds of cannon fire rattled the tent, but his focus remained fixed. The plan had been simple in theory. Divide the American forces, crush them swiftly, and march triumphantly to Albany. Yet here they were, bogged down in this wilderness, facing an enemy far more tenacious than he had anticipated. "Sir," Colonel James Hamilton entered, his expression grim. "Our left flank is under heavy fire. The rebels have sharpshooters in the woods." Burgoyne's jaw tightened. He had underestimated these colonials. Their unorthodox tactics, hiding in the trees, picking off officers, were maddeningly effective. Still, he refused to show doubt. "Reinforce the flank," he ordered. "Philip's artillery will break their line." Hamilton hesitated. "We've lost several officers already. The men are faltering." Burgoyne slammed his fist on the table. "Then make them stand. We cannot falter here. The Empire depends on this victory." As Hamilton saluted and left, Burgoyne straightened his coat and stepped outside. The sight that greeted him was anything but reassuring. Smoke and fire filled the air, and the once orderly lines of his army were fraying under the relentless pressure of the rebel assault. This was not how it was supposed to go. A tavern in Albany, September 19, 1777. Sarah Osborne listened carefully, her hands busy with the pretense of cleaning mugs. The British officers seated at the corner table were speaking in low tones, their voices heavy with frustration. They were discussing supply lines, Fiatkas, and the main battles in Beirut in the west. Kovat, Burgoyne's Achilles' heel? "They're stretched too thin," one of them muttered, his words slurring slightly from drink. If the rebels cut us off, Sarah's pulse quickened. She had heard enough to know that this information could be vital. Carefully, she slipped into the back room, where her young son waited. "Stay here," she whispered, placing a hand on his cheek. Outside, the night was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the fiery chaos she knew was raging just miles away. Sarah moved swiftly, her heart pounding as she made her way to the edge of town. She had a message to deliver, and no time to waste. American Headquarters, Bemis Heights, September 19, 1777. General Horatio Gates paced the dimly lit tent, his face drawn with tension. The map before him displayed the battlefield's grim realities. Freeman's Farm was a cauldron of violence, and every courier arriving from the front lines brought mixed news. Across the table, Benedict Arnold leaned forward, his voice sharp with frustration. "We're holding them back, but not for long if we don't press the attack." His words carried the weight of a man who thrived on action, a stark contrast to Gates's cautious demeanor. Gates straightened, his hands clasped behind his back. "We don't have the numbers to risk an all-out assault," he said evenly. "Let them exhaust themselves. Our position here is strong." Arnold slammed his fist on the table, causing a candle to flicker. "They'll regroup, damn it. If we let them retreat unscathed, they'll come back stronger. We need to cripple them now." The two men locked eyes, the tension between them thick. Outside, the sounds of musket fire echoed faintly, a grim reminder of the stakes. "This is my army, Arnold," Gates said coldly, "and we'll fight this my way." Arnold rose abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "Then you'll be the one to explain failure to Congress," he spat, storming out into the night. Gates remained still, staring at the map. He knew Arnold was right, but admitting it was another matter entirely. Freeman's Farm, September 19, 1777. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked fields. Timothy Murphy crouched behind a fallen log, his rifle balanced on the wood. Around him, the air was thick with smoke and fear. To his left, Daniel Morgan appeared, his face streaked with grime. "Murphy," he barked, crouching beside him. "See that officer on the horse?" He pointed toward a distant figure commanding British troops. "That's Fraser. Take him out." Murphy hesitated. He knew the name. Brigadier General Simon Fraser, one of the British Army's finest minds. Killing him could cripple their command. But the shot would be almost impossible, even for him. "I'll need to get closer," Murphy muttered, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. Morgan nodded. "Then do it. We'll cover you." Murphy slid through the underbrush, every movement deliberate. The British officer grew larger in his sights, his voice ringing out over the chaos. Murphy steadied his breathing, raised his rifle, and fired. The shot echoed across the battlefield. Fraser slumped in the saddle, then toppled to the ground. A roar went up from the American lines, and the British advance faltered. Murphy didn't celebrate. He reloaded quickly, knowing his job was far from over. British lines, Freeman's Farm, September 19, 1777. Brigadier General Simon Fraser gasped for breath, his hand clutching the wound in his side. Around him, soldiers shouted frantically, some firing blindly into the woods, others scrambling to carry him to safety. William Phillips, his fellow officer, knelt beside him. "Gold on Fraser," he said, his voice steady, despite the panic in his eyes. "We'll get you back to camp." Fraser shook his head weakly. "It's no use," he whispered. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining the immaculate red of his uniform. "Tell Burgoyne, tell him to retreat. There's no victory here." Philip swallowed hard, his jaw clenching. He nodded, though the words were a bitter pill. Fraser's eyes closed and a heavy silence fell over the men around him. As they carried his body from the field, the morale of the British troops crumbled. Fraser had been their anchor, and without him, the chaos threatened to consume them. Albany to Bemis Heights, September 20, 1777. Sarah Osborne's feet ached as she trudged through the dense forest. The message she carried, hidden in the folds of her skirt, was worth more than her life. It detailed the British Army's dwindling supplies and growing desperation. Intelligence she had overheard in the tavern. The path was treacherous, and every rustle in the underbrush set her nerves on edge. The thought of British patrols haunted her, but so did the faces of her children. They depended on her, as did the soldiers fighting just miles away. When she finally reached the American camp at Bemis Heights, she was stopped by sentries. "I have information," she said, breathlessly, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "For General Gates." The soldiers exchanged skeptical glances, but escorted her to the command tent. Gates looked up as she entered, his expression guarded. "Speak," he said, simply. Sarah relayed what she had heard, her words steady and clear. Gates' eyes narrowed, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "You've done a great service, ma'am," he said. "This could turn the tide." Sarah left the tent with a mix of relief and apprehension. Her part in the war was small, but it was enough to tip the scales. American Field Hospital, September 20, 1777. Dr. John Cochrane wiped his bloodied hands on his apron, his face lined with exhaustion. The makeshift hospital was a scene of chaos, men groaning in pain, the air thick with the stench of sweat and infection. "Next," he called, though his voice was hoarse. A soldier was carried in, his leg mangled by a musket ball. Cochrane examined the wound quickly, his expression grim. "Amputation," he said. The man's eyes widened in fear, but he nodded, clenching his jaw. Cochrane worked with practiced efficiency, the saw biting through bone. The soldier screamed, then fell silent, his body limp. A nurse pressed a cloth to the stump, trying to staunch the bleeding. "Move him out," Cochrane said, already turning to the next patient. There was no time for sentiment. Outside the tent, Abigail Andrews, a volunteer nurse, sat beside a young soldier with a bandaged arm. "You're lucky," she said softly, handing him a cup of water. "Most don't walk out of here." The soldier nodded, his eyes hollow. "Luck doesn't feel like much when your friends don't make it," he muttered. Abigail didn't reply. She had no words for the kind of loss that hung over this place. British camp near Freeman's Farm, September 20, 1777. General John Burgoyne stared at the casualty reports piling up on his desk. The neat handwriting of his adjutant contrasted sharply with the grim numbers it conveyed. Hundreds dead, more wounded, and morale plummeting. Brigadier General William Phillips entered the tent, his face dark with worry. "Fraser's loss has shaken the men," he said bluntly. "Desertions are increasing, and without reinforcements, sir." He trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought. Burgoyne closed his eyes, rubbing his temples. Every decision he had made felt like a step deeper into quicksand. They were isolated, with no word from General Clinton's forces to the south. Supplies were running dangerously low, and their position was increasingly untenable. "Pull the men back to our defensive lines," Burgoyne ordered finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "We hold until reinforcements arrive, or until we have no choice but to retreat." Phillips nodded, though his expression betrayed doubt. Burgoyne watched him leave, then glanced again at the casualty list. These men had followed him into the wilderness with faith in his leadership. Now he wasn't sure that faith was deserved. American Headquarters, Bemis Heights, September the 22nd, 1777. EQ. Benedict Arnold stormed into the officer's tent, his anger barely contained. General Horatio Gates sat at the head of the table, his expression as calm as a stone wall. "You removed me from the field," Arnold bellowed, slamming his fist onto the table. "While men were dying, you left me sitting here like a damned clerk." Gates looked up slowly, his eyes cold. "Your reckless behavior nearly cost us our position. I will not have this army jeopardized by your impulsiveness." Arnold's face reddened. "Reckless? My men held the line while you did nothing. Freeman's Farm was won by action, not hesitation." The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the growing rift. Gates stood, his voice low but cutting. "This is my command, Arnold. If you cannot follow orders, you are free to leave." Arnold clenched his fists, his entire body taut with fury. "Perhaps I will," he spat, before turning on his heel and leaving the tent. Outside, the camp was alive with activity, but Arnold saw none of it. His thoughts churned with bitterness. He had given everything to this cause, but it seemed loyalty was a one-way street. A farmstead near the battlefield, September 26th, 1777. Mary McCrea sat by the window of her small farmhouse, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The distant sounds of cannon fire were a constant reminder of how close the war had come to her home. Her heart ached as she thought of her younger brother Nathan. He had joined the Continental Army months ago, full of fire and conviction. She hadn't heard from him since the fighting began. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find a weary soldier, his uniform tattered and his face lined with exhaustion. "Are you Mary McCrea?" he asked softly. She nodded, her throat tight with dread. The soldier reached into his coat and pulled out a folded letter. "Your brother wanted you to have this," he said. Mary's hands trembled as she took the letter. She didn't need to open it to know what it meant. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, clutching the letter to her chest. The soldier knelt beside her, his voice gentle. "He fought bravely. You should be proud." Mary nodded, tears streaming down her face. The war had taken so much already, but this loss cut deeper than any wound. British camp near Freeman's Farm, September 22, 1777. Private James Haddon lay awake in his tent, staring at the canvas roof above him. Around him, the camp was quiet, save for the occasional cough or murmur of a fellow soldier. But his mind was anything but still. The army was falling apart. Fraser's death had shaken everyone, and rumors of an imminent retreat spread like wildfire. Supplies were scarce, morale was non-existent, and James was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of fear, and tired of a war that no longer felt just. As the camp settled deeper into sleep, James made his decision. He slipped out of his tent, careful not to wake the others. The chill of the night air bit at his skin, but he moved quickly, his footsteps silent on the soft ground. He had memorized the sentries' patrol routes, and he waited patiently for his moment. When it came, he darted into the woods, his heart pounding. Every snap of a twig made him freeze, convinced he had been caught. But as the hours passed and the camp faded into the distance, relief began to creep in. He didn't know where he would go or what he would do, but anything was better than this. American Camp, Bemis Heights, September 23, 1777. Timothy Murphy sat by the campfire, his rifle resting across his knees. The night was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past days. Around him, his fellow sharpshooters talked in low tones, but Murphy stayed silent, lost in thought. The image of General Fraser falling from his horse replayed in his mind. It had been a clean shot, one he had taken hundreds of times before. But this one felt different. Fraser wasn't just another soldier. He was a leader, a man who had likely left behind a family, friends, and comrades who looked up to him. "Murphy," Daniel Morgan's voice broke through his thoughts. The older man sat down beside him, his gaze steady. "You did good out there." Murphy shrugged, staring into the fire. "Feels more like murder than war," he muttered. Morgan nodded slowly. "War makes killers of us all," he said. "But what you did saved lives. Remember that." Murphy didn't respond. He wasn't sure he believed it. But as the fire crackled and the night stretched on, he found a small measure of comfort in Morgan's words. Bemis Heights, September 24, 1777. Ensign John Enos of the British 29th Regiment tightened his grip on his musket as the sun rose over the American positions. Burgoyne's orders were clear: hold the redoubt at all costs. The crude earthwork fortifications offered little comfort against the American cannons, which had begun their relentless bombardment at dawn. Nearby, Captain James Craig barked commands, his voice rising above the roar of artillery. "Stand your ground! Prepare for an assault!" His determination was evident, but even he knew the British line was stretched too thin. The Americans charged, their war cries piercing the din of battle. Leading the charge was Benedict Arnold, his anger and frustration channeling into reckless bravery. His presence galvanized the Continental soldiers, who surged forward with a ferocity that stunned the British defenders. Annis fired his musket, the recoil jolting through his shoulder. He watched as the first wave of Americans fell, only for another to take their place. Panic gripped the British line as Arnold's men reached the redoubt, clambering over the defences with bayonets fixed. In the chaos, Ennis locked eyes with an American soldier, both men frozen for a moment that felt like eternity. Then the soldier lunged, and Ennis barely parried the thrust with his bayonet. The melee was brutal and close, the redoubt devolving into a maelstrom of blood and desperation. By the day's end, the redoubt was lost. Ennis, bloodied but alive, retreated with what remained of his unit. The cost of holding their ground had been too high, and the Americans' momentum seemed unstoppable. American Field Hospital, Bemis Heights, September 25th, 1777. Benedict Arnold groaned in pain as surgeons worked on his leg, shattered by a musket ball during the assault on the redoubt. Sweat dripped from his brow, his teeth clenched against the agony. Dr. John Cochrane hovered over him, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. "You're lucky the ball didn't sever the artery," Cochrane said, his voice calm but firm. "We'll save the leg, but you won't be walking anytime soon." Arnold's response was a growl of frustration. He hated being sidelined, especially now, when the tide of battle was turning in their favor. "Just get me back on my feet," he muttered. Outside the tent, soldiers whispered about Arnold's heroism. Despite his contentious relationship with Gates, Arnold had led the charge that broke the British line. For many, he was a hero, though Arnold himself found little solace in their admiration. As the surgeons finished their work, Arnold stared at the canvas ceiling, his thoughts racing. The pain in his leg was nothing compared to the sting of betrayal he felt from Gates, but he resolved then and there that he would not be forgotten, no matter the cost. British encampment, September 26, 1777. Major Heinrich Bremen, commanding a detachment of Brunswickers, reviewed his orders with a sinking feeling. The German auxiliaries, hired by the British Crown, had fought valiantly at Saratoga, but their numbers were dwindling, supplies were scarce, and the loyalty of the local population was non-existent. Bremen addressed his officers, his voice firm despite his doubts. "We hold this position until reinforcements arrive. Discipline will be the key to survival." The officers nodded, though their faces betrayed their uncertainty. The Americans were relentless, their knowledge of the terrain giving them a decisive edge. That night, Bremen wrote in his journal, describing the grim realities of their situation. "We are not soldiers of fortune," he penned, "but men caught in a conflict not our own, yet we will do our duty, for honor demands it." When the American forces attacked the next morning, Bremen's troops fought with the precision and discipline for which they were known. But even their formidable resolve could not withstand the sheer numbers and determination of the Continental Army. Bremen himself was mortally wounded in the fray, his dying thoughts not of victory or defeat, but of his homeland far across the sea. Near Bemis Heights, September 27, 1777. Nathaniel Peabody, a young courier for the Continental Army, rode hard through the dense woods. He carried a critical message from General Gates to Colonel Daniel Morgan, detailing the next phase of their assault. Every second counted, and the risk of capture was high. The woods were eerily quiet. The only sounds, the rhythmic pounding of his horse's hooves, and the occasional rustle of leaves. Nathaniel's heart raced as he approached a narrow ravine, a perfect spot for an ambush. His instincts proved correct. A group of British scouts emerged from the underbrush, their muskets aimed squarely at him. "Halt!" one of them shouted. Nathaniel spurred his horse forward, ignoring the warning. Shots rang out, and pain exploded in his side. He gritted his teeth, clutching the reins tightly as his horse surged ahead. When he finally reached Morgan's camp, he collapsed from his saddle, the message clutched in his bloodied hand. Morgan himself rushed to his side, taking the dispatch with a solemn nod. Nathaniel's eyes fluttered open briefly. "Did I make it?" he rasped. Morgan squeezed his shoulder. "You did, son. You did." Nathaniel managed a weak smile before his eyes closed for the last time. His sacrifice ensured the Americans could press their advantage, a small but vital piece in the puzzle of victory. American Headquarters, Bemis Heights, September 28, 1777. General Horatio Gates stood at the edge of the ridge, watching the British camp below. Smoke from their dwindling campfires curled into the morning air, a sign of their desperation. A courier arrived with the latest report. "The British are pulling back, sir," he said. "Their lines are faltering." Gates nodded, his expression unreadable. The victory was within reach, but he knew the cost had been high. Thousands of men, on both sides, had paid the ultimate price in these fields. He turned to his officers, his voice steady. "Send word to Congress, the enemy is retreating. Saratoga will be ours." The officers saluted, their faces alight with a mixture of relief and pride. As Gates watched them go, he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The Battle of Saratoga would be remembered as a turning point in the war, a victory won through sacrifice, strategy, and the unyielding spirit of the Continental Army. British encampment, Saratoga, October 10, 1777. General John Burgoyne sat in his command tent, staring at the map spread before him. The situation was dire. His army, surrounded on all sides, was running out of food, ammunition, and options. The Americans' superior positioning and relentless attacks had left him with few choices. Brigadier General Simon Fraser's death weighed heavily on Burgoyne. Fraser had been the heart of the British forces, and his loss had demoralized the troops. Desertions increased daily, and sickness ran rampant. General William Phillips entered, his face grim. "Sir, our scouts report that the Americans are fortifying their lines further. Clinton's reinforcements are nowhere in sight." Burgoyne exhaled deeply. He knew what Phillips wasn't saying aloud. Surrender was inevitable. "Summon my officers," he said quietly. "We must discuss terms." As the officers gathered, the mood was somber. Burgoyne addressed them with measured calm. "We have fought valiantly, but further resistance would mean the needless slaughter of our men. We will send an envoy to Gates to negotiate terms of surrender." The officers exchanged glances, some nodding reluctantly, others staring at the ground. Burgoyne's voice softened. "This is not the end of the war, but for us, it must be the end of this battle." American Lines, Saratoga, October 12, 1777. Lieutenant Henry Kingston, one of Burgoyne's aides, rode under a white flag toward the American camp. The tension in his chest was palpable. He carried a letter addressed to General Horatio Gates, proposing a ceasefire and the terms of surrender. As Kingston approached the American lines, he was stopped by a contingent of soldiers, their muskets raised. "State your business," one of them barked. "I come on behalf of General Burgoyne," Kingston said, raising the letter. "A message for your commander." The soldiers escorted him to Gates's headquarters, where the general awaited. Gates, composed and dignified, accepted the letter without a word. He read it carefully, his expression revealing nothing. Finally, Gates looked up. "Inform General Burgoyne that we are open to discussions. However, our terms will not be lenient." Kingston nodded, relief washing over him. He mounted his horse and rode back to deliver Gates's message. As he returned to the British camp, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing the end of an era. British Headquarters, Saratoga, October 13, 1777. General Burgoyne sat at a long table opposite General Gates, flanked by their respective aides. The air was thick with tension as the two commanders negotiated the terms of surrender. Gates, ever pragmatic, outlined his demands. "Your army will lay down its arms and march out under guard. Officers may retain their personal belongings and sidearms. Your troops will be returned to England, provided they pledge not to serve in this conflict again." Burgoyne listened intently, his face impassive. When Gates finished, Burgoyne spoke. My men are soldiers, not criminals. I ask that they be treated with dignity. Gates nodded. They will be treated fairly, as long as they abide by the terms. After hours of deliberation, the two men shook hands. The agreement, known as the Convention of Saratoga, was finalized. For the British, it was a bitter end to a hard-fought campaign. For the Americans, it was a victory that would resonate far beyond the battlefield. Saratoga Battlefield, October 17, 1977. The British Army, numbering over 5,000 men, marched out of their camp in solemn silence. Their muskets had been stacked, their banners furled. General Burgoyne, resplendent in his uniform, led the procession, his face a mask of stoic dignity. American soldiers lined the path, watching the defeated army with a mix of triumph and respect. For many, this was the first time they had seen their enemy up close. The British soldiers, once a symbol of invincibility, now looked weary and broken. Among the Continental soldiers, Timothy Murphy stood with his rifle slung over his shoulder. He observed the British troops, noting their downcast eyes and slow, deliberate steps. Even lions can be brought low, he murmured to himself. Nearby, Daniel Morgan crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. They fought hard, he said quietly. But today, the wilderness claimed its victory. As the British passed, Burgoyne exchanged a nod with Gates, a silent acknowledgement of the respect between adversaries. For both men, the moment was bittersweet, a testament to the complexities of war. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, October 20, 1777. In the halls of the Continental Congress, news of the victory at Saratoga sparked a wave of celebration. Delegates cheered and toasted the success, hailing it as the turning point in the war. Benjamin Franklin, stationed in Paris as an envoy to France, received word of the victory with great satisfaction. He immediately relayed the news to French officials, emphasizing its significance. This victory proves the resolve and capability of our forces, Franklin wrote to Congress. It will undoubtedly strengthen our case for an alliance with France. The victory at Saratoga did indeed shift the geopolitical landscape. France, seeing the potential for an American triumph, began formal negotiations to enter the war. The alliance, forged in the coming months, would provide the Continental Army with the resources and support it desperately needed. For the soldiers who had fought and bled in the wilderness of Saratoga, the victory was a testament to their resilience. For the fledgling nation, it was a beacon of hope, a sign that independence was within reach. British Camp, Albany, October 27th, 1777. As the surrendered British soldiers settled into their temporary encampment near Albany, General John Burgoyne faced the bitter reality of his failure. His once proud army was now disarmed, their morale shattered. Letters from London weighed heavily on his mind, full of warnings about the precariousness of his ambitious campaign. Colonel John Peters of the Loyalist King's Rangers, who had fought under Burgoyne's command, struggled to reconcile his loyalty to the crown with the humiliating loss. He sat by a campfire, penning a letter to his family back in Vermont. The wilderness itself seemed to conspire against us, he wrote, and the Americans fought with a determination I have never seen before. For Burgoyne, the coming weeks would be marked by interrogation and blame. Word had already reached London that his failure was viewed as a disastrous blow to British authority in the colonies. As he prepared for his journey back to England, he reflected on the decisions that had led to this moment. Saratoga would not only define his career, it would haunt him for the rest of his life. American Headquarters, Bemis Heights, October 27, 1777. General Horatio Gates stood atop Bemis Heights, surveying the battlefield where so many lives had been lost. The scent of gunpowder still lingered in the air, mingling with the earthy aroma of the forest. The victory was theirs, but it had come at a high cost. Benedict Arnold, recuperating from his injury, had grown increasingly resentful of Gates. Though Arnold's bravery had been pivotal in securing the victory, Gates had downplayed his contributions in his official reports to Congress. Arnold's frustration simmered beneath the surface, setting the stage for the choices that would later define his legacy. Colonel Daniel Morgan, the leader of the elite riflemen, approached Gates. "The men fought well," Morgan said, his tone measured. "But they're tired, and winter is coming. We need to plan for the next phase." Gates nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He was already writing letters to Congress, emphasizing his role in the victory and positioning himself as a potential successor to George Washington. For Gates, the battlefield was as much political as it was military. American Lines, October 25, 1777. As the details of the Convention of Saratoga were finalized, British and American officers met to oversee the formalities. Major General William Phillips, representing the British, worked closely with American delegates, including Colonel James Wilkinson. The atmosphere was tense, but respectful. The agreement stipulated that the British soldiers would be marched to Boston, where they would await transport back to England. However, the Continental Congress would later revoke these terms, holding the British troops as prisoners of war, a decision that would create diplomatic friction. Captain John Stark, a hero of the Battle of Bennington, watched the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. For Stark, the victory at Saratoga was a vindication of the determination of ordinary men fighting for an extraordinary cause. As the British prepared to march out of Saratoga, many American soldiers took a moment to reflect on the enormity of what they had accomplished. For the first time, it seemed possible that the dream of independence might become a reality. Backwoods of New York, late October 1777. Timothy Murphy, the sharpshooter whose legendary shot had mortally wounded General Simon Fraser, returned to his regiment a hero. His comrades in Morgan's Rifle Corps celebrated his skill, though Murphy himself remained humble. "I was just doing my duty," Murphy said when questioned about the shot. But within the ranks, his story grew into a legend, inspiring his fellow soldiers and striking fear into the hearts of the British. Murphy's exploits did not end with Saratoga. In the years to come, he would continue to serve with distinction, his name becoming synonymous with the elite riflemen of the Continental Army. For Murphy, Saratoga was not just a battle. It was a defining moment in a life dedicated to the cause of freedom. Paris, France, December 1777. Across the Atlantic, Benjamin Franklin sat in the lavish court of King Louis XVI, presenting the news of Saratoga to the French ministers. The victory had proven the viability of the American cause, and Franklin's diplomatic charm had laid the groundwork for an alliance. Comte de Vergennes, the French foreign minister, saw Saratoga as a turning point. "The Americans have shown they can defeat the British in open battle," he remarked to Franklin. "It is time for France to act." By early 1778, France would formally enter the war, providing critical military and financial support to the fledgling United States. The alliance, forged in the aftermath of Saratoga, would tip the scales of the Revolutionary War, ensuring that the sacrifices made on the battlefield would not be in vain. Albany, New York, November 1777. As the remnants of General Burgoyne's army lingered in captivity near Albany, the approach of winter deepened their misery. For the British and Hessian soldiers, the cold was a bitter reminder of their defeat. Among them was Lieutenant Frederick von Riedesel, commander of the Brunswick troops, who struggled to keep morale high among his men. Von Riedessel's wife, Baroness Friederike Charlotte, had followed the army throughout the campaign, tending to the sick and wounded. Now she became a source of comfort to the soldiers. She wrote in her journal, "We are alive, but barely. The men speak often of home, their voices heavy with longing." In contrast, the American forces were buoyed by their victory but wary of the challenges ahead. Colonel Daniel Morgan's riflemen prepared to move south, where their skills would be needed in future campaigns. Morgan, though proud of his men's accomplishments, worried about their physical state after months of harsh conditions and intense fighting. For both sides, the coming winter was a time of reflection, a pause in the conflict, but not in its toll. The Battle of Saratoga had changed the trajectory of the war, but the end was still far from sight. Albany, New York, December 1777. Benedict Arnold's leg was still healing from the grievous wound he had sustained at Saratoga. Confined to a small room in Albany, Arnold brooded over his treatment by General Gates and Congress. Despite his bravery on the battlefield, Arnold had received little recognition for his role in the victory. He wrote angrily to a friend, "Am I to be cast aside, my sacrifices ignored, while others reap the rewards of my blood and toil?" The letter revealed the seeds of discontent that would later lead Arnold down a path of betrayal. Arnold's wife, Margaret Peggy Shippen, tried to console him, but her efforts only partially soothed his wounded pride. She was a loyalist sympathizer, and her influence would later play a crucial role in Arnold's infamous defection. In the quiet of his recovery, Arnold began to question his loyalty to the American cause. For now, he remained committed to the revolution, but his bitterness hinted at the turmoil yet to come. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, January 1778. While Benedict Arnold's faith in the revolution faltered, others, like Benjamin Franklin, remained resolute. News of Saratoga had galvanized the Continental Congress, and Franklin used the victory as leverage in his negotiations with France. In Philadelphia, the city buzzed with renewed hope. John Adams, ever pragmatic, warned his colleagues, "This war is far from over. We must not let one victory breed complacency." Adams's words underscored the delicate balance the revolution required, a mix of optimism and relentless effort. For ordinary citizens, Saratoga had become a symbol of possibility. Sarah Bache, Franklin's daughter, organized relief efforts for soldiers, knitting socks and collecting supplies. Her letters reflected the determination of many civilians to support the cause. "We cannot fight as the men do, but we can give them the strength to persevere," she wrote to her father. Saratoga was more than a military triumph. It was a rallying cry for a nation still fighting to define itself. New York City, February 1778. Apakatamilai. In British-occupied New York City, loyalist John Butler received word of the defeat at Saratoga with dismay. Butler, leader of the loyalist militia known as Butler's Rangers, knew that the loss would embolden the Patriots and increase resistance in the frontier regions. Butler wrote to General Sir Henry Clinton, "The rebels grow bolder with each passing day. We must act decisively, or the Crown will lose its hold on the colonies entirely. For loyalists like Butler, the war was not just about political allegiance, it was a fight for survival. Many had seen their homes burned and their families targeted by Patriot forces. The defeat at Saratoga intensified the pressure on loyalist militias to regain control in the contested territories. Butler's resolve hardened. He began planning raids along the New York-Pennsylvania border, determined to strike fear into the hearts of Patriot settlers. For Butler and others like him, the war was personal, a struggle not just for a cause, but for their way of life. Versailles, France, February 1778. In the opulent court of Versailles, Benjamin Franklin stood before King Louis XVI and his ministers. Saratoga had finally convinced the French monarchy that the American cause was worth supporting. Vergennes, the French foreign minister, declared, "This is our opportunity to weaken Britain and secure our influence in the Americas." The Treaty of Alliance was signed on February 6, 1778, formalizing France's commitment to the war. Franklin's correspondence to Congress reflected his triumph. "The French have pledged their support. This alliance will change the course of the war." For the Continental Army, France's entry into the conflict brought hope of much-needed supplies, reinforcements, and naval power. The alliance was a testament to the importance of Saratoga, not just as a battlefield victory, but as a turning point in the global struggle for independence. London, England, March 1778. In the grand halls of Parliament, the news of the British surrender at Saratoga sparked outrage and debate. Lord George Germain, Secretary of State for the Colonies, found himself under relentless scrutiny. His strategy for splitting the colonies via the Hudson River campaign had failed spectacularly, and he struggled to defend his decisions before his critics. Opposition leaders, including Charles James Fox, seized the moment to call for peace. "This war is unwinnable," Fox thundered. "How many more British lives must be sacrificed in this folly?" Yet Prime Minister Lord North remained committed to quelling the rebellion, though even he expressed doubts about the feasibility of ultimate victory. For General John Burgoyne, who had returned to London to face an inquiry, the humiliation was palpable. His once illustrious career was now overshadowed by the stigma of Saratoga. In private letters, he defended his actions, blaming logistical failures, lack of reinforcements, and poor coordination among British command. The loss at Saratoga reverberated across the Atlantic, shifting the political calculus in London and planting seeds of doubt in the British Empire's ability to maintain its hold on the American colonies. Valley, Forge, Pennsylvania, March 1778. As winter began to wane, the Continental Army emerged from its harsh encampment at Valley Forge. General George Washington, ever vigilant, used the time to rebuild and reorganize his forces. Saratoga had given the army a morale boost, but the reality of their situation was grim. Poor supplies, disease, and desertion continued to plague the ranks. Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a Prussian military officer who had arrived to assist the American cause, began training the soldiers in European military techniques. His efforts transformed the ragged Continental Army into a disciplined fighting force. "These men have the spirit," von Steuben observed, "but they need the tools to channel it." Among the soldiers was Joseph Plum Martin, a young private whose diary captured the struggles of the winter. "Our bellies were empty, our clothes in tatters," he wrote, "but the hope of freedom kept us standing." For Martin and his comrades, Saratoga was proof that victory was possible, even against the mighty British Empire. Saratoga Battlefield, Spring 1778. As spring arrived, the fields of Saratoga began to bloom again, though scars of the battle remained. Local civilians, like Sarah Strong, continued to recover from the devastation. Her family's farm had been trampled during the conflict, and she had spent months tending to wounded soldiers. Sarah's brother, Benjamin Strong, had fought with the New York militia and was now buried alongside his comrades in a makeshift cemetery. Sarah visited his grave often, her grief mingled with pride. "He died for something greater than himself," she told her young nephew, planting wild flowers near the gravesite. For many civilians, the cost of war was deeply personal. Their sacrifices, losing loved ones, homes and livelihoods, were the hidden foundation of the patriot cause. Yet their resilience spoke to the enduring strength of the American spirit. Hudson River, New York, May 1778. With France now an active ally, the war entered a new phase. French naval forces threatened British supply lines, while French troops prepared to join the fight on American soil. For General Henry Clinton, who had replaced General Howe as the British commander-in-chief in America, the challenge grew exponentially. Clinton wrote to Germain, "We face a war on multiple fronts. Without significant reinforcements, the situation will only deteriorate." Yet British resources were stretched thin, with conflicts brewing in the Caribbean and India. On the American side, General Philip Schuyler, who had been instrumental in the early stages of the Saratoga campaign, worked to coordinate efforts along the Hudson. Though he had been overshadowed by Gates, Schuyler's leadership remained crucial to securing the region. The strategic significance of Saratoga continued to ripple outward as the British reeled from the loss and the Americans gained confidence in their ability to win the war. Albany, New York, June 1778. Major Henry Dearborn, a Continental officer who had fought at Saratoga, reflected on the battle's significance as he prepared his troops for the next campaign. In his journal he wrote, "Saratoga was a turning point, but the road ahead remains treacherous. The enemy is wounded, not defeated." Dearborn's men included veterans of Saratoga, as well as fresh recruits eager to prove themselves. Among them was Peter Salem, an African-American soldier who had joined the fight for independence, despite the uncertain promise of freedom for enslaved people. Salem's courage inspired those around him, and he viewed Saratoga as proof that determination could overcome even the greatest obstacles. As the Continental Army moved south, Dearborn and his troops carried the lessons of Saratoga with them. They knew the war's outcome rested on their ability to adapt, persevere, and maintain their resolve in the face of adversity. Mohawk Valley, New York, summer 1778. The aftermath of Saratoga brought devastation to many Loyalist families, who found themselves targeted by Patriot militias emboldened by the victory. Among them was Mary Brunt, also known as Molly Brunt, a Mohawk woman and prominent Loyalist figure who had played a critical role in rallying the Iroquois Confederacy to support the British. With her brother, Joseph Brant, Thayendanegea, she had navigated the delicate balance of protecting her people's interests while aligning with British forces. The defeat at Saratoga shattered the illusion of security for the Mohawk. Mary's settlement near the Mohawk River was attacked by Patriot forces, forcing her to flee with her children and other Loyalists. Joseph, deeply affected by the loss at Saratoga, intensified his campaign of resistance. Leading Loyalist to banded Iroquois warriors, he struck back in raids across the New York frontier. His letters to British commanders were filled with frustration. "We have given all for the King's cause, yet we are left to fend for ourselves." For the Brants and many other Loyalists, The war was not just a battle for territory. It was a fight for survival in a world where allegiances often led to ruin. British-occupied Philadelphia, July 1778. In the shadows of British-occupied Philadelphia, Patriot spy Lydia Darragh risked everything to gather intelligence on British troop movements. A Quaker by faith, she had kept a low profile during the war, but the victory at Saratoga inspired her to take greater risks. One evening, British officers held a meeting in her home, unaware of Lydia's allegiance to the Patriot cause. From behind a closed door, she listened intently, learning of plans for a surprise attack on Washington's army. Under the cover of darkness, Lydia slipped past British sentries and delivered the critical information to Continental forces. Her actions reflected the quiet heroism of many civilians who contributed to the war effort in unseen ways. Saratoga had shown that the British could be defeated, but victories required not just soldiers on the battlefield, but also those who operated in the shadows. Boston Harbor, Massachusetts, August 1778. Boston Harbor was alive with activity as French warships arrived, carrying troops and supplies. The alliance formed after Saratoga was now a reality, and General Marquis de Lafayette, already a beloved figure in the Continental Army, eagerly welcomed his countrymen. Among the French officers was Admiral Charles Hector, Comte d'Estaing, who commanded the naval forces. Though his initial efforts in Rhode Island met mixed success, his presence demonstrated France's commitment to the war. In a letter to George Washington, d'Estaing wrote, "The defeat at Saratoga has opened the door for a partnership that will secure liberty for your people and strike at the heart of Britain's power." For Washington, the arrival of French reinforcements was a beacon of hope. He convened his officers to discuss strategy, knowing that cooperation with the French forces would be key to maintaining momentum after Saratoga. Monmouth, New Jersey, June 28, 1778. The Continental Army's transformation since Saratoga was put to the test at the Battle of Monmouth. General Charles Lee, recently exchanged from British captivity, led an advance against British forces retreating from Philadelphia. However, Lee's hesitation and poor coordination nearly ended in disaster. General Washington, furious at Lee's incompetence, personally rallied the troops, riding into the fray and restoring order. Among the soldiers was Mary Ludwig Hayes, known as Molly Pitcher, who carried water to the men under fire and even took over her husband's cannon when he was injured. Private Joseph Plum Martin later wrote of the battle, "The sun blazed as fiercely as the enemy, yet we held our ground, proving that we were no longer the ragged army of years past." Though the battle was tactically inconclusive, it demonstrated the Continental Army's growing professionalism, thanks in part to the lessons learned at Saratoga and the training at Valley Forge. Albany, New York, summer 1778. The Saratoga campaign had displaced thousands of civilians, both patriot and loyalist. In Albany, Abigail McCrea, a young woman whose family had been caught in the crossfire, struggled to rebuild her life. Her fiancé, a loyalist soldier, had been killed during the retreat, leaving Abigail torn between grief and relief. Her family's farm lay in ruins, and Abigail turned to the local community for support. The city's leaders, including Philip Schuyler, organized relief efforts for those affected by the war. Schuyler's daughters, Angelica and Elizabeth, worked tirelessly to provide food and shelter for displaced families. Abigail's story mirrored those of countless others who had suffered during the Saratoga campaign. For them, the victory was bittersweet, a step toward independence, but one that came at a heavy cost.